Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the hidden chambers of European royal courts, where the most powerful women weren't wearing crowns. Picture this: a king sits on his throne, making decisions that will shape nations, wage wars, and alter history. But behind closed doors, another voice whispers in his ear, a woman who holds no official title, yet controls everything. She's not the queen, she's the mistress. And in the courts of France and England from the 1600s to the 1800s, these women wielded more power than most monarchs ever dreamed of. Tonight, you'll discover how they did it, and why the world tried so hard to forget them. Now, before we step into these royal bedchambers together, I need your help for just a moment. If this story intrigues you, if you're curious about the secrets history tried to bury, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And hey, I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from right now? Your bedroom, your living room. Maybe you're tucked under the covers with the lights low. Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Whether you're in New York or Tokyo, London or Los Angeles, we're all here together tonight, about to uncover something extraordinary. So, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's begin. You know, we grow up learning about kings and queens, Henry the Heath, Louis XV, Elizabeth the Fuse, names that echo through history books. But here's what they don't teach you in school. For every famous king, there was often a woman behind him who history conveniently forgot to mention. Not his wife, not the woman wearing the crown and waving from balconies. No, I'm talking about the woman who shared his bed, yes, but also his secrets, his fears, his ambitions. The woman who read his letters, advised him on war strategies, chose his ministers, and sometimes even signed official documents in his name. In France, they had a special title for her, met it literally official mistress. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't a scandal whispered about in dark corners. It was a position at court with its own apartments, its own budget, its own salary. Imagine that for a second. While the queen lived in her gilded cage, bound by protocol and expectations, the official mistress had something far more valuable: access, real intimate daily access to the most powerful man in the kingdom. But here's where it gets fascinating. In England, they didn't have this official title. British kings were expected to be more discreet. At least that was the theory. In practice, well, we'll get to that. But the key difference was this: French mistresses had a job description. They were acknowledged, given titles, estates, influence. English mistresses had to work in the shadows, officially invisible but practically indispensable. Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. Why did these kings need mistresses in the first place? And I'm not talking about the obvious physical reasons, though yes, that was part of it. I'm talking about something deeper, something more human. Royal marriages in this era were business transactions, political alliances sealed with a wedding ring. A French princess married to a Spanish prince to prevent war. An English duke wed to a German countess to secure trade routes. Love, that was a luxury royalty couldn't afford. The king barely knew his wife before their wedding night. Often they didn't even speak the same language. Their marriage existed to produce heirs and unite kingdoms, not to provide companionship or intimacy or understanding. So the king would marry his political bride. They'd do their duty, produce the required children, appear together at state functions, and then he'd find someone else. Someone he could actually talk to, someone who made him laugh, who challenged his ideas, who knew how to navigate the brutal politics of court life, someone who chose to be with him not because a treaty demanded it, but because she wanted to. And here's the twist that nobody talks about. These women weren't just beautiful. I mean, yes, they were attractive. Physical appeal certainly helped, but that wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. Beauty fades. Beauty gets boring. Beauty can be found anywhere in a royal court. What kept these women in power for decades wasn't their looks, it was their minds, their political instincts, their ability to read people, to anticipate problems, to offer solutions the king's official advisors couldn't see. They were counselors, diplomats, strategists, wrapped in silk gowns and jewels, yes, but operating with the shrewdness of any prime minister. Take Diana Dyer, for example. She was the mistress of King Henri II of France for 25 years. 25 years. She didn't start this affair as some young, naive beauty. When their romantic relationship began, she was 35 years old and he was 15. Yes, you heard that right. We'll dive deeper into their story soon, but here's what matters now. Diane maintained her influence over Henri for his entire reign. Not because she was the prettiest woman at court. There were always younger, prettier women around. But because she was irreplaceable, she understood politics. She knew how to advise him. She became his most trusted confidant. Foreign ambassadors knew that if you wanted something from the King of France, you didn't just bring gifts for the Queen. You brought gifts for Diane. And that right there is the key insight that most people miss about royal mistresses. History wants to reduce them to one thing: sex. Scandalous affair. Women using their bodies to manipulate powerful men. It's a comfortable narrative because it keeps these women small, keeps them in their place. Oh, she was just a pretty distraction. But the truth is so much more complex and fascinating. These women were power brokers. They shaped the course of European history. They started wars and ended them. They built monuments that still stand today. They patronized the greatest artists and writers of their age. And they did it all while navigating the most dangerous political landscape imaginable. A world where one wrong move, one loss of favor, could mean exile, disgrace or death. Consider this. In France during the 1700s, if you wanted to become a general, a minister, a bishop, any position of real power, you needed the king's approval. But how did you get the king's attention? How did you make your case when dozens of other ambitious men were trying to do the same thing? You went through his mistress. She was the gatekeeper. She decided who got an audience with the king, whose letters made it to his desk, whose names came up in pillow talk after the candles were blown out. Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of Louis XV in the mid-700s, functioned as what historians now call a de facto prime minister. She didn't just influence policy, she made policy. She appointed military commanders. She negotiated with foreign ambassadors. And when France entered the disastrous 7 Years' War, guess who got blamed? Not just the king. Pompadour shouldered much of that political fallout. Now, let's talk about something that might make you uncomfortable: power and gender in these royal courts. Because here's the paradox. Women in this era had almost no official power. They couldn't inherit thrones in most countries. They couldn't hold government positions. They were legal property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. Queens are expected to sit quietly, bear children, and smile at state dinners. But mistresses, they operated outside these rules. They weren't constrained by the expectations placed on wives and daughters. They couldn't be queens, so they weren't bound by queenly behavior. And, ironically, this gave them more freedom to exercise real influence. As one historian put it, in the early French court, there was no real division between formal and informal political power. If you were the king's friend, or more than a friend, that made you politically influential, full stop. The most powerful woman at court was rarely the woman wearing the crown. It was the woman sharing the king's bed, reading his correspondence, and whispering advice between the silk sheets. Think about poor Catherine de' Medici, married to Henry II of France. She was the queen. She gave him 10 children. She was intelligent, educated, from one of the most powerful families in Italy. And for 26 years of marriage she lived completely in the shadow of her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. When Henry traveled, he took Diane, not Catherine. When important decisions needed to be made, he consulted Diane, not Catherine. The Queen of France was essentially a supporting character in her own life story. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something I want you to think about as we continue through these stories. Were these women victims or victors? Were they exploited or empowered? It's not a simple answer. They lived in a world that gave women almost no legitimate paths to power. So, they took the paths available to them, however problematic we might find them today. They used intelligence, charm, ambition, and yes, sexuality to carve out spaces where they could exercise real influence. Some were born into poverty and died as duchesses. Some shaped the arts and architecture of their nations. Some seated intellectuals and advanced Enlightenment ideas, and some, frankly, were just as ruthless in power, hungry as any male politician of their era, which honestly is its own kind of equality, isn't it? One more thing before we dive deeper into specific stories. I mentioned earlier that French mistresses were more official than English ones, but don't let that fool you into thinking English royal mistresses were any less influential. King Charles II of England, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, had 13 known mistresses, 13, and he didn't hide them. He paraded them around London. He gave them houses near his palace, showered them with jewels, acknowledged their children. One of his mistresses, Barbara Palmer, had apartments at the palace that were more lavish than the Queen's. The public could buy portraits and engravings of the king's mistresses. They were celebrities, 17th century versions of Instagram influencers, if you will. And perhaps the most beloved of all was Nell Gwynn, an actress who sold oranges in the theater before catching the king's eye. The English public adored her because she was funny, down to earth, and fiercely loyal to England. When people confused her carriage with that of Charles's French mistress one day, Nell stuck her head out the window and shouted to the angry crowd, "Don't worry, good people. I'm just the Protestant whore." The crowd loved her for it, a mistress with a sense of humor and national pride. Now that was something they could get behind. But beneath all the glamour, the jewels, the power, and the influence, there was always danger. These women lived precarious lives. Their entire existence depended on one man's affection, and kings, however powerful, were still mortal. When a king died, his mistress's protection died with him, and that's when the real drama began, as we'll see when we explore what happened to Diane de Poitiers the moment Henri VI breathed his last breath. So that's the world we're entering together. A world where power and gender played out in the most intimate spaces of royal palaces, where women with no official authority shaped the destiny of nations, where love and ambition, sex and politics became so intertwined that you couldn't separate one from the other. These stories aren't just scandalous gossip. Though yes, there's plenty of scandal ahead. These are stories about power, how it's gained, how it's kept, and how quickly it can be lost. They're about women who refused to accept the limitations placed on them, who used every tool at their disposal, beauty, intelligence, charm, ruthlessness, to write themselves into history, even if history then tried to erase them. In the next part of our journey, we're going to meet one of the most extraordinary women of the 16th century, Diane d'Poitiers, a woman who was already widowed and in her 30 seconds when she caught the eye of a teenage prince, a woman who would rule France from the shadows for a quarter of a century, wielding more power than any queen. And when you hear her story, when you understand the intelligence and strategy behind her rise to power, you'll never think about royal mistresses the same way again. So let me tell you about a woman who defied every rule we think we know about power, age, and desire. Her name was Diane d'Poitiers, and her story is so extraordinary that if I told you it was fiction, you'd say it was too unbelievable to be true. But every word of what you're about to hear actually happened. January 9th, 1500. A baby girl is born in the Dauphiné region of France to one of the oldest noble families in the land. Her name is Diane. She grows up beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she grows up educated, trained in Latin, Greek rhetoric, horsemanship, and the deadly art of court politics. At 15, she's married off to Louis de Brasse, a man who is 39 years her senior. Think about that age gap for a moment. When Diane was a teenager, her husband was already approaching 50. But here's the interesting part. Louis was the grandson of a king and a royal mistress himself. Diane was literally being trained through her marriage in the art of navigating royal power structures. Louis dies in 1531, and 31-year-old Diane becomes a widow. Now, in that era, widowhood usually meant retirement from public life, quiet mourning, religious devotion, managing your estates. Diane does none of that. Instead, she does something brilliant. She adopts permanent widow's attire, black and white, the colors of mourning, but she doesn't retreat. She becomes a lady in waiting to the French royal family. And that's when her path crosses with a young boy who will change her life forever. Henri, Duke of Orleans, second son of King Francis the Fess. When Diane first meets him, he's just a child. And here's where the story gets genuinely heartbreaking before it gets fascinating. In 1526, when Henri is only 7 years old, he and his older brother are sent to Spain as hostages. Their father, the King of France, has been captured in battle by the Holy Roman Emperor, and the price of the king's freedom is his sons. For 4 years, these young boys are imprisoned in Spain. They're isolated, uncertain if they'll ever see their family again, subjected to harsh conditions that no child should endure. When Henri finally returns to France in 1530, he's 11 years old and deeply traumatized. He's shy, withdrawn, struggling to communicate. And who does he encounter at court? Diane Poitiers, a sophisticated, educated woman in her 30s who shows him kindness, who talks to him like he matters, who sees past his trauma to the person he could become. Now, I need to be honest with you about what happens next, because historians still debate the exact timeline. Sometime around 1533 to 1536, Diane becomes Henry's mistress. He's somewhere between 14 and 17. She's in her mid-30s. And yes, by modern standards, this is deeply problematic. We need to acknowledge that. But to understand this story, we have to understand the context. Royal princes in the 16th century were considered adults much earlier than we'd accept today. They were married at 14, sent to war at 15. And for Henri, Diane wasn't just a lover. She was a mentor, a mother figure, a guide through the brutal world of French court politics. In 1533, Henri is married to Catherine de' Medici, a political alliance. Catherine is 14, Henry is 14, and everyone expects them to produce heirs and secure the succession. There's just one problem. Henry doesn't love his wife. He can barely tolerate her. The person he loves, the person he's already loved for years, is Diane. And here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Most affairs burn hot and fade fast, right? Passion, drama, then someone moves on. But Henry's devotion to Diane never waver. Not for a year, not for 5 years, not for 25 years. From the time he's a teenager until the day he dies at 40, Henry is completely, utterly, almost obsessively devoted to this woman. Can you imagine? Think about your teenage crush. Now imagine that crush lasting your entire life, never diminishing, never being replaced. That was Henry and Diane. In 1536, everything changes. Henry's older brother, the heir to the throne, collapses after playing tennis and dies. Mysteriously. Some whisper poison. We'll never know for sure. But suddenly, Henry is no longer the spare. He's the heir to the French throne. And Diane Poitiers, the widow in her late 30s, is now the mistress of the future King of France. This is when her real genius reveals itself. Diane could have been content with being Henry's lover. She could have asked for jewel and pretty dresses and stayed in the background. Instead, she becomes his advisor, his partner, his political strategist. When Henry struggles with the complexities of court life, Diane guides him. When he needs to navigate dangerous political waters, Diane helps him see the currents beneath the surface. But she's not universally loved, not by a long shot. Henri's father, King Francois I, has his own official mistress, a woman named Anne de Salor. And Anne hates Diane. In 1544, Anne convinces the king that Henry and Diane are plotting against him, spreading lies, sowing distrust. King Francois banishes Diane from court. This should have been the end of her story. A mistress exiled is a mistress finished, but here's what happens instead. Henry leaves too. The heir to the French throne walks away from court to be with Diane. He chooses her over his father's approval, over political advantage, over everything. That's not just infatuation. That's not just lust. That's something deeper, a bond that transcended everything the 16th century understood about relationships. Francois dies in 1547. Henry becomes King Henry II of France. He's 28 years old, and the first thing he does, the very first thing, is bring Diane back. Not quietly, not discreetly. He makes her his official mistress and gives her a gift that stuns the entire court, the Duche of Valentino. Diane is now a duchess. A commoner's widow is now one of the highest-ranking noble women in France. But that's not all. Henri gives her something even more valuable, la Polée. This was a tax on all military, ecclesiastical, and civil appointments in France. Every single person who wanted a government position had to pay this tax, and all that money, it went directly to Diane. When she protests, this seems to me all too great a gift. Henry's response is perfect. It is my royal pleasure to lay Ella as a nosegay at your feet. A no. Say gay? He's treating a massive source of government revenue like a bouquet of flowers. This makes Diane spectacularly wealthy. But more importantly, it makes her spectacularly powerful. Because now anyone who wants a position in the French government has to pay Diane's tax. They know she has the king's ear. They know she can make or break careers. So what do? They court her favor. They bring her gifts. They seek her advice. Foreign ambassadors don't just visit the king, they visit Diane too. The Venetian ambassador writes home. The Duchess of Valentino rules the roast. That's a direct quote from historical records. And get this, Henry creates a royal monogram to symbolize his reign. At first glance, it looks like two interlaced C's forming an H. You'd think the C's stand for Catherine, his wife and queen. But look closer. Those C's can also be read as D's for Diane. He literally encrypted his mistress's initials into the official symbol of his kingship. That monogram appears everywhere, on buildings, on documents, on cannons and weapons. France's military went to war carrying Henry's declaration of love for Diane literally stamped on their artillery. Even more audaciously, Henry signs official state documents, documents that will be preserved in national archives for centuries, with a combined signature, Henri Diane, one name, as if they're one entity, as if she's co-ruling France with him. Because in many ways she is. Now let's talk about Catherine de' Medici, because her part in this story is absolutely heartbreaking. She's the Queen of France. She's from one of the most powerful families in Italy, the Medici, banking dynasties, patrons of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. She's educated, intelligent, politically savvy, and she's completely, utterly powerless in her own marriage. For 10 years after her wedding, Catherine doesn't get pregnant. 10 years in oil. Courts. A queen's only real job is producing heirs. If she can't do that, she's worthless. Or worse, she could be set aside, divorced, sent home in disgrace. Catherine is desperate. And you know what the court whispers? That she's barren. That Henry should divorce her and marry someone who can give him children. But here's the twisted part. Diane actually helps Catherine. Yes, you heard that right. According to historical accounts, Diane gives Catherine advice on how to seduce her own husband. There's even a story possibly exaggerated, but rooted in real desperation that Catherine drills holes in the floor above Diane's chambers so she can watch Henry with his mistress and learn what he likes. Can you imagine? The humiliation, the degradation of having to spy on your husband with another woman just to figure out how to please him. But it works. In 1543, Catherine finally becomes pregnant. In January 1544, she gives birth to a son named Francis. And then the children just keep coming. 9 more babies over the next decade. Catherine is almost constantly pregnant throughout the 1540s and 1550s. She's done her duty. She's secured the succession. She's given France multiple heirs. And still, Henry prefers Diane. When he finishes his royal council meetings, he goes to Diane to discuss what happened. When foreign ambassadors arrive with gifts, they bring presents for both the Queen and the Duchess. When Henry travels through France, he takes Diane with him, not Catherine. The Queen of France becomes a supporting character in her own life. Think about the psychology of this for a moment. You're Catherine. You've given your husband 10 children. You've done everything expected of you as queen. And every night you watch him walk past your chambers to spend the evening with a woman 20 years older than him. A woman who holds no official title, beyond what your husband gives her, yet commands more respect, more influence, more love than you ever will. And Diane doesn't even have youth on her side anymore. By the 1550s, she's in her 52nds. Henri is in his 32nds, younger at his physical prime. There are countless younger, beautiful women at court who would jump at the chance to catch the king's eye. But Henry never strays. His devotion to Diane never waver. Why? What did she have that bound him so completely? It wasn't just beauty, though by all accounts she took extraordinary care of her appearance. Cold baths every morning, horseback riding to stay fit, a carefully managed diet. But plenty of women were beautiful. What Diane had was something more valuable. She understood Henri. She'd known him since he was a traumatized child. She'd guided him through his adolescence, supported him when he was just the second son, prepared him for kingship. She knew his weaknesses and his strengths. She could read his moods, anticipate his needs, advise him without threatening his pride. In modern terms, we might say they had emotional intimacy that transcended physical attraction. Diane was Henry's safe space in a world where everyone wanted something from him, and in a royal court where trust was rarer than gold, that was worth more than any treasure. But every story has shadows, and Diane's story is no exception. All of this power, all of this influence, all of this wealth, it rested entirely on one thing, Henry's heartbeat. As long as he lived, Diane was untouchable. She ruled France in all but name. But the moment his heart stopped beating, everything would change, and Catherine de' Medici, the humiliated queen who'd spent 26 years in Diane's shadow, was watching, waiting, remembering every slight, every humiliation, every moment she'd been made to feel invisible in her own palace. And in 1559, Catherine's patience would finally be rewarded. But not in any way that would bring her joy. Because what happens when a king dies in the most unexpected, brutal way imaginable? When a jousting accident turns a celebration into a tragedy, that's when we see who really held power and how quickly it could all disappear. That's when the true cost of being a royal mistress becomes devastatingly clear. Here's what nobody tells you about becoming a royal mistress. It wasn't about luck. It wasn't about just being in the right place at the right time with the right face. No, becoming and staying a royal mistress required a level of strategic thinking that would make modern CEOs jealous. These women were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. And the ones who succeeded, they understood something fundamental about power that most people miss entirely. Let me show you what I mean by taking you back to a moment that changed French history. The year is 1745. Jeanne Passon is a 23-year-old married woman living in Paris. She's beautiful, yes, but so are thousands of other women. She's educated and charming, but again, not unique in aristocratic circles. What makes her different is this. She has a plan, and that plan is about to make her the most powerful woman in France. But first, let's rewind a bit. When Jeanne Antoinette was just a little girl, some say around 9 years old, her mother took her to a fortune teller, a woman who read palms and predicted futures. And this fortune teller looked at little Eat's hand and said something remarkable. "One day you will reign over the heart of a king." Now most people would hear this and laugh it off as fantasy. Zenunet's family wasn't royal. They weren't even nobility. They were bourgeoisie middle class, the kind of people who made money in business and finance. In the rigid class system of 18th century France, the distance between a bourgeois girl and a king's bed was like the distance between Earth and the stars, impossible to cross. But here's the thing about Jeanne Antoinette. She believed it, or maybe she decided to make it true. From that moment on, her entire education becomes focused on a single goal. Her wealthy guardian, a man named Len Normandin de Tunam, who may or may not have been her biological father, spares no expense. She learns music, singing, dancing, acting. She studies art, literature, philosophy. She becomes fluent in the social graces of high society. She learns how to hold a conversation about Voltaire's latest play, how to appreciate a fine painting, how to make powerful men feel not just desired but understood. At 20, she's married off to a guardian's nephew, Charles Guam-Lunor. It's a good match. He's wealthy, rising in society. They have a daughter. By all accounts, she should be content with this comfortable bourgeois life. But Jeanne Antoinette hasn't forgotten that fortune teller's prediction, and she knows something important. King Louis XV is grieving. His previous mistress, the Duchess Chaturu, has just died suddenly. The king is alone, vulnerable, looking for companionship. So Jeanette does something brilliant. She finds out where the king hunts, the royal forests where he rides out with his courtiers, away from the formality of Versailles, and she starts appearing there purely by coincidence, of course, always dressed immaculately, always in the right place to be noticed. She rides through the forest in a bright pink carriage that's impossible to miss, or sometimes in a striking blue one. She's not chasing him. She's simply there, visible, intriguing. The king notices, how could he not, this beautiful, mysterious woman who keeps appearing at the edges of his hunting parties. And when they finally meet, properly at a masked ball in February 1745, Jeanne Antoinette is ready. She's costumed as Diana the Huntress, a not-so subtle message that she's the prey worth catching, and Louis XIII, dressed as a yew tree with his courtiers, is captivated. But here's what's genius about Jeanne Antoinette's strategy. She doesn't just rely on attraction. She offers Louis XV something he desperately needs: intellectual companionship. His wife, Queen Marie Legínska, is 8 years older than him and has completely withdrawn from his life after bearing 10 children. She's focused on religion and prayer. She's told the king she wants no more physical intimacy. Louis is trapped in a marriage that's become a shell, and his court is full of ambitious people who want things from him. Jeanne Antoinette offers him someone he can actually talk to, someone who makes him laugh, someone who understands art and ideas and can challenge him intellectually. Within months, she becomes his official mistress. But there's a problem. She's not noble. And in France, you can't be the Mresse on unless you have a title. So Louis does something extraordinary. He purchases the estate of Pompadour and gives it to her along with the title of Mayoress. Jeanne Pon, the fortune teller's little girl, becomes Madame de Pompadour, and that fortune teller, she was right. Now contrast this with Diane Ditier's approach, because their strategies were completely different. Diane didn't seduce Henri with elaborate plans or strategic positioning. She did something even more subtle. She became indispensable as a mentor first. When Henri was young and traumatized, Diane offered him guidance, stability. She positioned herself not as a temptress, but as a wise advisor, a mother figure, someone he could trust in a world where trust was scarce. And here's the psychological brilliance of this. By the time their relationship became romantic, Henri was already emotionally dependent on her. She wasn't just someone he desired, she was someone he needed. That bond formed in his vulnerable youth proved unbreakable. Diane understood something profound. Sexual attraction fades, but emotional dependency lasts forever. Both women, Diane and Pompadour, also understood another crucial element of maintaining power. You don't just seduce the king, you manage the entire ecosystem around him. You befriend the right people, you neutralize potential rivals, you make yourself useful to others at court so they become invested in your success. Pompadour was exceptional at this. When she first arrived at Versailles, she was an outsider, a bourgeois woman crashing an aristocratic party. The nobles looked down on her. They whispered about her common origins, called her Madame Wish, a nasty play on her maiden name, which means fish. She could have been destroyed by this social hostility. Instead, she did something smart. She cultivated relationships with the intellectuals and artists, people like Voltaire and Dado who didn't care about noble bloodlines. She became a patron of the arts, commissioning buildings and supporting the Sèvres porcelain manufacturing. She made herself culturally important, not just romantically relevant. And she did one more thing that was absolutely critical. She managed her relationship with the Queen. Now, you'd think the Queen and the mistress would be mortal enemies, right? But Pompadour was too clever for that. She was always respectful to Queen Marie, never openly disrespectful. She understood that if she made an enemy of the Queen, she'd make enemies of everyone loyal to the Queen. So she walked this incredibly fine line, close to the king, but never openly hostile to his wife. Think about the emotional intelligence required for that. You're sleeping with a woman's husband. You have more influence over him than she does, and yet you have to maintain a cordial, respectful relationship with her. That's not just being charming. That's being a diplomatic genius. Let me tell you about another strategy these women used. They understood the power of reinvention. Barbara Palmer, one of Charles Theft of England's most powerful mistresses, constantly adapted her approach. When Charles started to lose interest, she didn't just accept it. She became more politically active, positioning herself as a valuable ally who could help ambitious courtiers gain access to the king. She transformed from lover to political broker, making herself too useful to discard completely. And here's something fascinating that rarely gets talked about. Many of these women understood how to weaponize jealousy, not their own jealousy, the king's. They'd cultivate friendships with attractive, powerful men at court, just close enough to make the king notice. Not affairs, that would be treason, but flirtations. Attention from other men that reminded the king that his mistress was desired by others, that he was lucky to have her, that he shouldn't take her for granted. Diane de Poitiers was masterful at this. She maintained close relationships with poets like Hansard, architects like Philibert Del, artists and intellectuals who openly admired her, their dedications, their poems praising her beauty and wisdom. All of this reinforced to Henry that he possessed something valuable, something other men wanted but couldn't have. But let's talk about the element that I think is most important and most often misunderstood. These women offered something that might sound simple but was actually revolutionary. They offered these kings the experience of being chosen. Think about it. A king's wife didn't choose him. She was assigned to him by political treaty. His courtiers bowed to him because they had to. His servants obeyed because it was their job. Everyone around a king wanted something from him or feared him, but a mistress chose to be. Yes, there were material benefits, but she could theoretically refuse. She could walk away. And that element of choice, that voluntary nature of the relationship, made it feel more real, more authentic than anything else in a king's life. In a world of political, theater and mandatory difference, the mistress offered something that felt like genuine intimacy. Pompadour understood this deeply. Even after she and Louis XV stopped being physically intimate around 1750, yes, their romantic relationship became platonic after just 5 years. She remained his closest confidant for 14 more years until her death. Why? Because she'd evolved beyond being just a lover. She'd become his best friend, his advisor, his intellectual companion, the person he wanted to talk to about everything from building projects to political appointments to his fears about France's future. This is what the successful mistresses understood. Attraction gets you in the door, but utility keeps you in the room. You have to offer value beyond the physical. Intelligence, political savvy, emotional support, entertainment, the ability to manage the complex social dynamics of court life, the wisdom to advise without seeming to instruct, the charm to make the king feel brilliant while subtly guiding his decisions. And here's the thing that I find most remarkable. These skills, reading people, building alliances, strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, these are the same skills that make someone successful in any era. A royal mistress in the 1700s was essentially running an elaborate networking and relationship management operation that would translate perfectly to modern corporate or political environments. They were CEOs of their own one-person enterprises, and their product was themselves. But with all this strategy, all this planning, all this brilliant maneuvering, there was always one thing they could, and control. One variable that made their entire world precarious. Time, age, and the simple biological fact that kings were mortal. All of this power, all of this influence, all of these carefully constructed relationships rested on one single heartbeat. And when that heart stopped, well, that's when we see just how fragile this power really was. That's when the carefully built empires came crashing down. And that's when women like Pompadour proved their true genius, by finding ways to make themselves indispensable even as physical passion faded. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand just how far Pompadour's influence reached and what she accomplished during her 20 years at the peak of French power. There's a moment in 1756 that perfectly captures just how powerful Madame de Pompadour had become. Picture this, the Palace of Versailles, the most magnificent royal residence in Europe, the king's private study, and in that room, 3 people are bent over architectural plans making decisions about France's future. One is King Louis X. One is the Marquis de Marigny, the director of royal buildings. And one is a woman who just 11 years earlier had noble blood whatsoever. A woman whose father had fled France in disgrace, whose family made their money and financed the kind of people aristocrats whispered about at parties. That woman is now helping decide where France will build its military academy, how Paris will be redesigned, what the future of French architecture will look like. That's not just influence, that's power. Real, tangible, world-shaping power. And the question we need to ask is, how did she do it? How did Genuette Passon, daughter of a disgraced financier married to a bourgeois tax collector, become the woman historians now call the de facto Prime Minister of France? Let's start with something that made her completely unique among royal mistresses. She was the first commoner to ever hold the position of maîtresse in French history. Every mistress before her had been born into nobility. They might not have been duchesses, but they were at least from aristocratic families with centuries of pedigree. Pompadour, her family had money, sure, but money doesn't buy noble blood. And in 18th century France, that distinction mattered more than almost anything. When she first arrived at Versailles in 1745, the aristocratic courtiers were scandalized. Who was this upstart, this nobody from nowhere? They called her Madame Hoffish, Madame Poutempong in French, a vicious pun on her maiden name. They wrote cruel poems about her that circulated through Paris. They spread rumors that she'd been a prostitute, that her mother ran a brothel, that she'd slept her way through half of Paris before catching the king's attention. None of it was true. truth doesn't matter when people want to destroy you. But here's where Pompadour's genius really shows. Instead of trying to win over the aristocracy, which was probably impossible, she went around them. She cultivated a different power base entirely. The intellectuals, the artists, the philosophers of the Enlightenment who were beginning to question whether noble birth really made someone superior. In 1751, just 6 years after becoming the king's mistress, Pompadour does something extraordinary. She supports the publication of the first volumes of the Encyclopédie, the massive project by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent Dallin to catalogue all human knowledge. Now, this might not sound revolutionary, but the Encyclopédie was dangerous. It questioned religious dogma. It challenged traditional authority. It suggested that reason and science mattered more than birth and tradition. The Catholic Church wanted it banned. Conservative nobles wanted it destroyed. But Pompadour protected it. She convinced Louis XV to allow its publication. And why? Because she understood something the aristocracy didn't. The world was changing. New ideas were emerging that would eventually lead to revolution, though she wouldn't live to see it. By aligning herself with these intellectuals, she positioned herself on the side of progress, of enlightenment, of the future. Voltaire, one of the greatest minds of the age, was one of her closest friends. In 1745, the same year she became the official mistress, Pompadour convinced Louis X to appoint Voltaire as royal historiographer and give him apartments at Versailles. When she died in 1764, Voltaire wrote, "I'm very sad at the death of Madame de Pompadour. I was indebted to her, and I mourn her out of gratitude." It seems absurd that while an ancient pen-pusher hardly able to walk should still be alive, a beautiful woman in the midst of a splendid career should die at the age of 42. 42. She died at 42, after 20 years of managing one of the most stressful, demanding positions imaginable, being the emotional, intellectual, and political partner to the King of France. But in those 20 years, she accomplished more than most people do in a lifetime. Let's talk about what she actually built, because this is where Pompadour's legacy becomes concrete. You know, the Petit Trianon, that beautiful little palace at Versailles that Marie Antoinette would later make famous. Pompadour commissioned that. She worked with her brother and the king to design it, though she died before it was completed. The École Military in Paris, the military academy that trained Napoleon Bonaparte, among others. Pompadour's project, the Pilou d'Affund, now called the Place de Concorde, one of the most famous squares in Paris. Pompadour pushed for its creation. But her most lasting contribution might be the Sèvres porcelain manufactory. In 1756, she helped establish this oil factory, and Sèvres porcelain became, and still is, some of the finest and most expensive porcelain in the world. When you see porcelain in a museum today, you're looking at Pompadour's legacy. She didn't just influence art. She created industries that lasted centuries. And here's what's fascinating. She did all of this while navigating an impossible personal situation. Remember, by 1750, just 5 years after becoming the official mistress, she and Louis Vine stopped having a physical relationship. Why? Sources suggest that Pompadour was never particularly interested in the sexual aspect of their relationship. Some historians speculate she may have been naturally low in sexual desire. Others suggest the stress and pressure of court life affected her health. Whatever the reason, by 1751 their relationship had become platonic. Now, in any other case, this would have been the end. A mistress who's no longer sleeping with the king. She's finished, right? But Pompadour understood something crucial. She'd made herself indispensable in other ways. She was Louis's best friend, his confidant, his advisor, the person who organized his private theater performances, who made him laugh, who helped him think through complex political problems. She had evolved from mistress to something more like a business partner in the enterprise of running France. But she also understood that Louis still had physical needs. So she did something that was either brilliantly pragmatic or deeply cynical, depending on how you look at it. She helped procure other women for him. young women from lesser noble families who were brought to a house in Versailles called the Parcos, the deer, park. These women would have brief affairs with the king, carefully managed and controlled, and then be married off with generous dowies. This arrangement kept Louise satisfied, while ensuring that no single woman could replace Pompadour's position. No, emotional attachment developed with these temporary lovers. They were physical relationships, nothing more. Meanwhile, Pompadour remained the emotional center of Louis. Was this arrangement morally questionable? Absolutely, but it worked. Pompadour kept her position for 14 more years after their romantic relationship ended, an almost unprecedented achievement. Now, let's talk about her political role, because this is where things get really controversial. In 1756, France enters the 7 Years' War, a massive conflict that eventually involves every major European power. Pompadour is heavily involved in the diplomatic maneuvering that leads to this war. She helps forge an alliance with Austria, France's traditional enemy, against Prussia. This is called the Diplomatic Revolution, and it completely reshapes European politics. The war is a disaster for France. They lose most of their colonial empire in North America and India. The royal treasury is depleted, and who gets blamed? Pompadour. Pamphlets circulate calling her a warmonger, accusing her of leading France to ruin for her own vanity. The aristocracy, who already hated her, now had a concrete reason to point fingers. This is what happens, they said, when you let a commoner influence policy. But here's the more nuanced truth. Pompadour didn't make these decisions alone. Louis XV was the king. He made the final calls. Yes, she influenced him. That was her role. But the men who actually ran the war, the generals and ministers, were all part of the traditional power structure. When things went well, they took credit. When things went poorly, they blamed the woman who had no official title, no formal authority, and therefore couldn't defend herself in official channels. This is a pattern we see throughout history, isn't it? When things go wrong, blame the woman who was advising the man in charge. She wielded influence but had no official protection. She was powerful but also profoundly vulnerable. And yet, despite the hatred, despite the mockery, despite being blamed for a war she didn't start, Pompadour kept her position. She kept Louis's trust, because at the end of the day, in the quiet moments when the court wasn't watching, she was the person he wanted to talk to. She was the person who made him feel understood, valued, not just as a king, but as a human being. There's a story that captures this perfectly. In 1752, Pompadour was elevated to the rank of Duchess, the highest possible rank for a woman at court. And in 1756, she became the official lady-in-waiting to the Queen. Yes, you read that right. The King's mistress became the Queen's highest-ranking attendant. This position was usually reserved for women from the most ancient noble families, and it went to Jeanne-Antoinette Pont, whose grandfather had been a butcher. Can you imagine the audacity, the sheer nerve, but also the political brilliance? By making his mistress the Queen's lady-in-waiting, Louis was forcing everyone at court to treat Pompadour with a respect due to the highest rank. They had to bow to her. They had to acknowledge her authority. And Queen Marie, who could have refused this appointment, accepted it. Because by this point, even the Queen understood. Pompadour wasn't going anywhere. But every rise has a peak, and every life, no matter how brilliant, has an ending. By the early 1760s, Pompadour's health was failing. She had always been fragile. Frequent headaches, respiratory problems, a constitution that couldn't handle the stress she'd been under for 2 decades. In April 1764, she caught a violent headache and was diagnosed with congestion of the lungs. Within 2 months, she was dead, 42 years old. Louis X was devastated. This man, the King of France, who could have anyone who'd had multiple other lovers, watched the woman who'd been his companion for 20 years die. And he wept. He wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. Protocol forbade kings from attending funerals of anyone but family. but he stood at a balcony of Versailles, in the pouring rain, watching her funeral cortege leave, and supposedly said, "This is the only tribute I can pay her. 20 years, 2 decades of power, influence, cultural patronage, political maneuvering, and genuine friendship." And when she died, what remained? Buildings that still stand, porcelain that still amazes, philosophical work she protected that still influence us today, and a lesson about power that echoes through centuries. It's not where you come from that matters, it's what you do once you arrive. But Pompadour wasn't the only one who understood this lesson. Across the English Channel, in the bawdy, chaotic court of King Charles II, other women were learning their own ways to navigate power, women from even lower origins than Pompadour. Women who would prove that sometimes the most unlikely people end up leaving the biggest mark on history. Imagine waking up one morning as nobody, the daughter of a disgraced businessman, a woman with no title, no land, no real claim to anything, and then going to bed that same night as a duchess, with estates scattered across the country, with a personal income that rivals the richest nobles in the land, with servants bowing to you, courtiers seeking your favor, and foreign ambassadors bringing you gifts alongside those they bring the queen. That's not a fairy tale. That happened multiple times to multiple women. And tonight we need to talk about what these women actually receive for becoming royal mistresses, because the rewards were staggering. But we also need to talk about what they paid, because nothing, not power, not wealth, not even love, comes without a price tag. And for these women, the bill always came due eventually. Let's start with the sheer material wealth, because it's almost incomprehensible by modern standards. When Henri gave Diane Poitiers the Duché of Valentinois in 1548, he wasn't just giving her a fancy title, he was giving her an entire douche, lands, villages, forests, the right to collect taxes from everyone who lived there. She became one of the largest landowners in France overnight. But that was just the beginning. Remember l'éolate, that tax on government appointments we talked about earlier? Every person who wanted a position in the military, the church, or civil service had to pay this tax. And all that money flowed directly to Diane. We're talking about an enormous, continuous stream of wealth. The English ambassador to France wrote in a dispatch back to London that Diane ruleth the roost. She was so wealthy and powerful that she essentially controlled access to the French government. But wait, there's more. Henry also gave her the crown jewels of France. Not replicas, not imitations, the actual crown jewels that belonged to the French monarchy. He literally took jewels that should have stayed with the institution of the monarchy and gave them to his mistress. Can you imagine the scandal? The Queen, Catherine d'Emedy, had to watch as her husband handed over treasures that should have been hers to another woman. And the shadow. Oh, the shadow. Diane received the Château d'Anne, which Henry commissioned to be built specifically for her by France's greatest architect, Philippe Bedel. This wasn't just a house. It was a Renaissance masterpiece, a palace that screamed wealth and taste and power. But she also received Chenonceau, one of the most beautiful chateaux in all of France, spanning the river Cher like a bridge. Catherine wanted Chen so desperately. She'd expressed interest in it multiple times, but Henry gave it to Diane instead. That's not just generosity, that's a statement about who really mattered to him. Now let's jump across the English Channel to Charles's court, because the English did things a bit differently, but no less extravagantly. Barbara Palmer, later Lady Castleham and Duchess of Cleveland, received so much money from Charles' seat that historians have trouble tallying it all up. We're talking about annual pensions of thousands of pounds, lump sum payments, valuable properties, lucrative positions for her relatives. She was given apartments at Whitehall Palace that were more luxurious than Queen Catherine's rooms, more beautifully decorated, closer to the king's chambers. The message was clear. This woman matters more than the Queen. Charles also gave Barbara something that might seem strange to us now, but was incredibly valuable then. He legitimized her children. Now, there was some question about whether all of Barbara's children were actually Charles's. She wasn't exactly faithful to him either, but Charles acknowledged several of them as his own. That meant they received titles, positions, and places in society. Barbara's son became the Duke of Southampton. Her daughter married into high nobility. These children, born outside marriage, were set up for life. But here's where it gets really interesting. Charles II did this for multiple mistresses. He had at least 12, acknowledged illegitimate children by various women, and he gave them all titles and positions. The Duke of Monmouth, the Duke of St. Albans, the Duke of Richmond. He created an entire shadow aristocracy of his bastard children, all because he loved their mothers enough to secure their futures. Louise D'Irey, Charles's French mistress, became the Duchess of Portsmouth and received estates in England worth thousands of pounds per year. She also received gifts, jewels, cash payments, and influence that she used to benefit France. Remember, she was widely believed to be a French spy feeding information back to Louis XIII. Charles knew this. Everyone knew this, and he kept giving her money anyway because he genuinely cared for her. But let's pause here and ask a harder question. What did these women pay for? All this wealth, what was the cost? First, there was the scandal, the public mockery. Diana Poitiers had to endure poems and pamphlets calling her corrupt, accusing her of witchcraft. Yes, witchcraft, claiming she used dark magic to maintain Henry's devotion. They said she bathed in the blood of infants to stay young. None of it was true. But imagine having these lies circulate about you, published and sold in the streets of Paris, and being unable to respond because acknowledging them would make things worse. Pompadour had it even harder because she was common. The aristocracy never let her forget it. They called her Madame Poutampon, Madame Hawfish. They wrote pornographic poems about her and distributed them throughout Paris. They blamed her for every bad decision Louis XV made, every military defeat, every tax increase. When France lost the 7 Years' War and its colonial empire shrank dramatically, the pamphlet said it was Pompadour's fault. Never mind that she didn't command armies or negotiate treaties. She was the visible, vulnerable target. And then there was the isolation. Think about this. You're surrounded by people all the time. Courtiers, servants, nobles seeking favors. But how many of them actually like you? How many would stand by you if you lost the king's favor? Barbara Palmer discovered this the hard way. When Charles II's attention began to drift to other women, the courtiers who'd once fawned over her suddenly had other priorities. The people who'd sought her influence suddenly had less time for her. Fair-weather friends who'd loved her when she was powerful found reasons to be busy when her star began to fade. And we haven't even talked about the biggest cost yet. The knowledge that everything you have depends on one person's continued affection, one man. If he dies, if he loses interest, if someone younger or more beautiful catches his eye, everything goes away. All of it. The wealth, the power, the position, gone. Dando Poitiers learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. June 30th, 1559. A jousting tournament in Paris to celebrate the marriages of Henry's daughters. The king is 40, still, vigorous, still in love with his 60-year-old mistress. He's wearing Diane's colors, black and white, as he always does in tournaments. He's performing for her, showing off his prowess, but jousting is dangerous. A lance splinters. A fragment pierces Henry's eye, penetrates his brain. He's carried off the field, and for 10 days he lingers in agony. And here's where Catherine de' Medici finally, after 26 years of humiliation, gets her revenge. She bans Diane from Henry's bedchamber. The king asks for Diane repeatedly. He's dying and wants to see the woman he's loved his entire adult life, but Catherine refuses. She controls access now. She's the queen. Protocol is on her side, and she uses that protocol like a weapon, denying Henri and Diane their final goodbye. Imagine loving someone for 25 years and not being allowed to see them as they die. Henry dies on July 10th, 1559, and the moment, literally the moment he's dead, Catherine acts. She sends a letter to Diane demanding the return of the crown jewels, all of them. Immediately she forces Diane to give up Shenolo the Shadow. Diane has lovingly renovated and made beautiful in exchange for Shom, a far less desirable property. She doesn't destroy Diane financially. She's not quite that vindictive, but she strips away everything that symbolized Diane's power, and she banishes her from court. The woman who'd been the Shadow Queen of France for a quarter century is exiled to her estates, forbidden from returning to Paris or Versailles. Diane lives 6 more years in comfortable but isolated retirement at the Château d'Anne. She dies in 1566 after falling from her horse, still riding in her 60 seconds, still maintaining the physical fitness that had been part of her mystique. But those final 6 years must have been strange, going from being one of the most powerful women in Europe to being essentially erased from public life. And this pattern repeats throughout history. When Charles II died in 1685, his dying words included, "Let not poor Nelly starve," a reference to Nelwyn, the actress mistress he genuinely loved. But even with that deathbed plea, Nell faced serious financial troubles. His brother, James II, eventually honored some of Charles's wishes, but Nell died just 2 years after Charles, deep in debt, despite all the wealth she had accumulated. Barbara Palmer lived much longer. She died in 1709, 24 years after Charles, but her later years were marked by scandal, debt, and watching the influence she'd once wielded fade away. The apartments at Whitehall gone. The access to power vanished. She ended up embroiled in messy lawsuits and died in relative obscurity compared to her glory days. The only exception, the only mistress who died while still in power, was Pompadour. She maintained her position until her death in 1764. Never displaced, never exiled. But she paid for that security in other ways. The stress, the constant political maneuvering, the toll it took on her health. She died at 42, worn out from 2 decades of managing the most demanding relationship in France. So, here's what we need to understand. Yes, these women received staggering wealth. Yes, they lived in palaces and wore jewels worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Yes, they wielded real power and shaped history. But they also lived with constant uncertainty, public mockery, genuine danger, and the knowledge that it could all disappear in an instant. The price of power was paid not just when they fell from grace, but every single day they held that power in the stress, the isolation, the knowledge that they were always one step away from ruin. And nowhere is this more clear than when we look at what happened between these mistresses themselves. Because when the stakes are this high, when power and wealth and security all depend on one man's affection, women who might have been friends become enemies, the competition becomes vicious, and the casualties are real. That's the world we're stepping into next. May 29th, 1660. After years of civil war, after the execution of his father, after living in exile across Europe, Charles Stuart finally returns to England as king. Charles, the country is exhausted from Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell. No theatre, no music, no dancing, no joy. And Charles is about to make up for lost time in spectacular fashion. They didn't call him the Merry Monarch for nothing. Within weeks of his restoration to the throne, London transforms, theatres reopen, IC fills the streets, and Charles does something that shocks everyone. He makes it legal for women to perform on stage. Before this, all female parts in plays had been performed by young men in drag. But Charles had spent his exile in France, where actresses were celebrated, and he thought quite reasonably, why shouldn't English women have the same opportunity? But here's what really sets Charles apart from other monarchs we've discussed: his absolute shamelessness about his love life. Henry II had one mistress his entire adult life. Louis X was relatively discreet, keeping his affairs within the court. Charles II, he had at least 13 documented mistresses, 13, and he didn't hide them. He paraded them through London like trophies. He gave them houses near his palace. He showed up at the theatre with them. He had their portraits painted and hung in public galleries. The man had no shame whatsoever, and honestly, 17th century London kind of loved him for it. See, here's the thing about Charles. He'd watched his father lose his head literally because Charles had been too rigid, too formal, too convinced of his divine right to rule. Charles Stead learned from that. He understood that being a king wasn't just about power. It was about being likable, about giving people what they wanted. And what the English people wanted after decades of Puritan grimness was a king who knew how to have a good time. But let's be clear, Charles wasn't just some party-loving playboy. He was politically astute. He knew exactly what he was doing. His affairs with multiple women meant no single mistress could gain the kind of monopoly on power that Dion, Poitiers, or Pompadour had held. He diversified his emotional investments, if you will. Smart, actually. Now, before Charles even set foot back in England as king, he'd already begun an affair with a woman who would become his first official mistress, Barbara Palmer Navilliers. And Barbara was something else entirely. If Dander Poitiers was the sophisticated mentor and Pompadour was the intellectual companion, Barbara Palmer was pure, unapologetic ambition wrapped in spectacular beauty. Barbara was already married to Roger Palmer, a Catholic royalist who'd supported Charles during the wars, but marriage vows were apparently just suggestions to Barbara. She met Charles in 1660, shortly before his restoration, and within months she was pregnant with what everyone assumed was the king's child. She gave birth to a daughter in February 1661, 8 months after Charles returned to England. The timing was suggestive, but here's where Barbara's genius shows. She didn't hide. Other mistresses might have tried to be discreet, at least initially. Not Barbara. She demanded recognition. She demanded apartments at Whitehall Palace, and not just any apartments. She wanted rooms that were more lavish than the Queen's, and Charles, completely besotted, gave them to her. When Charles married Catherine of Banza in 1662, one of his wedding gifts to his new wife was appointing Barbara as her Lady of the Bedchamber. Yes, you read that, right. He made his mistress one of his wife's closest attendants. The audacity is almost breathtaking. Catherine, poor Catherine, initially refused. She was Portuguese, Catholic, raised with strict morals. She thought she could put her foot down. When she saw Barbara's name on the list of her ladies-in-waiting, she crossed it out, Charles insisted. Catherine cried. She had what we might now call a breakdown, literally collapsed when forced to accept Barbara's appointment. But she had no power here. She was a foreign queen in a country that had just restored its monarchy, married to a king who held all the cards. So Barbara became part of Catherine's household, and Catherine had to watch her husband's mistress every single day. And Barbara milked it for everything it was worth. She had at least 5 children that Charles acknowledged as his own, though there was gossip that some might have been fathered by other men. Barbara wasn't exactly faithful to Charles even while being his mistress. But Charles didn't seem to mind. He created her Duchess of Cleveland, gave her estates, showered her with money. At her peak, Barbara was one of the wealthiest women in England. But Barbara understood something important. She needed to be useful, not just beautiful. So she became a political operator. Men who wanted access to the king came to Barbara first. Henry Bennet, who became Earl of Arlington and one of Charles's most important ministers, gained his position partly through Barbara's influence. She became a gatekeeper, and gatekeepers have power. However, being Charles, Barbara was never going to be his only mistress. Enter the contrast. Noel Davis and Nell Gwynn, both actresses from the newly reopened theaters, both lowborn, both charming in completely different ways, and both about to become part of what we might call Charles's mistress management system. Noel Davis was from the Duke's Company Theatre. She was beautiful, a talented dancer and singer, and she caught Charles's eye around 1667. She bore him a daughter, Mary Tudor, and was set up in a nice house in Suffolk Street with a generous allowance. But Mole was never going to be more than a pleasant diversion for Charles. She didn't have the wit or the personality to hold his attention long term. But we'll get to the woman who did in just a moment. First, I want you to understand the sheer scale of what Charles was doing. He wasn't just having affairs. He was creating an entire parallel court system based on his love life. Think about it. Barbara Palmer had her faction at court, the people who allied with her to gain influence. His other mistresses had theirs. These women competed for resources for the king's time for public recognition, and Charles, brilliant, manipulative Charles, used this competition to his advantage. If one mistress became too demanding, he'd simply spend more time with another, keep them all slightly off balance, never let any single woman feel secure enough to push him too far. Now, compare this to the French system. In France, there was one maîtresse en titre at a time, one official position. If you were the king's mistress, you were it. You had the title, the authority, the clear position. In England, there was no official role, which meant multiple women could all claim to be the king's mistress simultaneously. It was messier, less formal, but in some ways more dynamic. Charles wasn't bound by traditional protocol. He could do whatever he wanted, and what he wanted, apparently, was variety. Louise de Caraway entered his life in 1670, and she was different from all the others. She was French, sent to England by Louis XIV essentially as a diplomatic gift, and yes, probably as a spy. She was aristocratic, cultured, sophisticated. Everything Barbara was not, and she was Catholic, which made her deeply unpopular with the English public, who are deeply suspicious of Catholics after years of religious conflict. Charles made Louise the Duchess of Portsmouth and gave her lavish apartments, expensive gifts, political influence. She bore him a son who was created Duke of Richmond, and while Barbara was dominant through force of personality, Louise was subtle. She worked behind the scenes. She wrote letters back to France. She influenced Charles's foreign policy. The English public despised her, called her Mrs. Carwell or Squintella, because she had a slight squint. But Charles valued her. She gave him something the others couldn't, a connection to France, to European sophistication, to the world beyond England's shores. So now imagine the situation at Charles's court. Barbara Palmer, the aging but still influential first mistress, defending her territory. Louise de Caraway, the French interloper with aristocratic pretensions and political connections. Mole Davis, the sweet but ultimately forgettable dancer. And several others I haven't even mentioned. Elizabeth Killigrew, Catherine Pegg, women whose names history barely remembers, but who were part of Charles's revolving court of affection. It's like a reality TV show, except the stakes of fortunes, titles, and your children's futures. And the drama was spectacular. These women didn't just compete with charm and beauty. They used every weapon at their disposal. Political alliances, public relations, whisper campaigns, financial manipulation. Barbara tried to undermine Louise at every turn. Louise used her French connections to make Barbara seem crude and old-fashioned. The competition was vicious. And then into this toxic environment of aristocratic mistresses, all clawing for position, Charles brings in someone completely different, someone who shouldn't have stood a chance, someone who was born in a coal cellar or a brothel, depending on which story you believe, someone who sold oranges in the theater before she learned to act, someone with no political connections, no aristocratic background, no sophistication whatsoever. But she had something none of the others had, something that would make her the most beloved royal mistress in English history, something that meant 365 years after her death, people still tell her stories with genuine affection. Her name was Eleanina Gwynn, but everyone called her Nell. And when you hear her story when you understand how a girl from the absolute bottom of society became the woman Charles the loved most. You'll understand why she's remembered when so many others are forgotten. February 2nd, 1650, somewhere in England, maybe London, maybe Oxford, historians still argue a baby girl is born to a woman named Helena Gwynn, the father unknown. Some say he was a soldier. Some say he was nobody at all. What we do know is this: little Helena Gwynn, Nell for short, enters the world with absolutely nothing. No father, no money, no prospects. Her mother runs what's politely called a boarding house and less politely called a brothel. Nell's childhood is spent serving drinks to drunk men in her mother's establishment. By any measure of 17th century England, she's destined for poverty, obscurity, or worse. And yet, 37 years later, when Nell dies, the King of England on his deathbed will use some of his final words to make sure she's taken care of. "Let not poor Nellie starve," he whispers to his brother. "Not take care of the Duchess of Portsmouth. Not remember Lady Castleham. Poor Nellie, the orange seller, the actress, the woman with no title, no aristocratic pretensions, and absolutely no filter whatsoever." How did that happen? How did the lowest of the low become the most beloved? That's the story we need to tell. Around 1663, when Nell is maybe 13 years old, she gets a job that will change her life. She becomes an orange girl at the King's Theatre in Drury Lane. Now, orange girls weren't just selling fruit. They were part of the theatre experience. Young women in low-cut dresses walking through the audience, flirting, taking messages between men in the crowd and actresses backstage. It was queasy, respectable work, emphasis on quease, but it put Nell in the right place at exactly the right time. Because here's what made Restoration theatre special. Charles had just legalized women performing on stage. For the first time in English history, actual women were playing women's parts, and the audience loved These actresses became celebrities, the Covent Garden goddesses they were called, and Nell, sharp-eyed and observant, watched them every night. She studied how they moved, how they spoke, how they made audiences laugh or cry. She was getting an education in performance just by being there. The actors noticed her too. How could they not? Nell had something you can't teach: presence, charisma. The diarist Samuel Pepys, who documented everything about Restoration London, attended a play on April 3rd, 1665, and wrote about pretty witty Nell. That's just her first name. She was already so well known that Pepys didn't need to say her last name. Everyone knew who Nell was. Within a year or two, Nell wasn't selling oranges anymore. She was on stage playing opposite Charles Hart, one of the leading actors of the King's Company, and she was good, really good. She specialized in comedy, playing bold, witty, sexually confident women who said what they thought and didn't apologize, which not coincidentally was exactly how Nell was in real life. She wasn't acting, she was just being herself, but louder. The playwright John Dryden started writing parts specifically for her. She played Florimel in Secret Love and absolutely stole the show. Pepys saw it and gushed about her performance. By 1668, Nell Gwynn is one of the most famous actresses in London. Everyone wants to see her. Everyone talks about her. And yes, everyone wants to sleep with her. She has affairs with actors. Charles Hart, who trained her almost certainly. Then Lord Buckhurst Charles. Sackville, a wealthy nobleman who takes her as his mistress briefly before, according to legend. She gets bored and leaves him. Nell was never someone who stayed where she didn't want to be. But these early relationships teach her important lessons about how to navigate the world of wealthy, powerful men. She's learning, always learning. And then, around 1668, King Charles II sees her perform. Now, Charles had been attending theatre regularly. He loved it, couldn't get enough of it. But there's something about Nell that captures his attention. Maybe it's her comic timing. Maybe it's the way she delivers a saucy epilogue while wearing men's clothing. She was famous for these cross-dressing performances. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe he just likes the way she makes him laugh. They begin an affair and Nell becomes pregnant. She gives birth to a son in 1670, Charles Beauclerk, who Charles will later make Duke of St. Albans. She has another son in 1671 named James, though this boy will die young. And here's where Nell's story diverges from all the other mistresses we've talked about. She doesn't accumulate massive wealth. She doesn't demand extravagant titles. She doesn't try to become politically influential. What does she do? She makes Charles laugh. She keeps things light. She's completely, utterly herself, irreverent, bawdy, funny, unpretentious. When Barbara Palmer is scheming and Louise Duroy is politicking, Nell is cracking jokes and enjoying life. And Charles, who spends his days managing a fractious parliament, dealing with religious tensions, and navigating complex European politics, finds that refreshing beyond measure. Here's a perfect example of Nell's personality. One day, she's riding through Oxford in her carriage when an angry crowd surrounds her. They think she's Louise de Carlisle, the French Catholic mistress that English Protestants despise. The mood is ugly. The crowd is shouting, threatening. Nell could panic. She could tell her driver to whip the horses and flee. Instead, she sticks her head out the window and yells, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." The crowd stops, thinks about it, and bursts into laughter and cheers. She's acknowledged exactly what she is. The king's mistress, yes, but English and Protestant one of them, and the crowd loves her for it. That story spread across London. People retold it at taverns, in markets, on street corners. Nell Gwynn, the people's mistress, the Protestant, the one who doesn't put on airs. See, Barbara Palmer had demanded respect. Louis Carraway had pretended to be something she wasn't. But Nell never pretended to be anything other than what she was, a girl from the slums who got lucky and ended up in bed with the king. She didn't try to act noble. She didn't try to seem refined. And the English public, sick of aristocratic pretension, suspicious of foreign influence, absolutely adored her for it. Samuel Pepys wrote that she had a heart-shaped face, hazel eyes, and chestnut brown hair. She was small, slender, shapely. But what really made her attractive was her personality, her humor, her lack of self-consciousness. Charles had mistresses who were more beautiful, more sophisticated, more connected, but none of them made him feel as comfortable as Nell. There's another famous story, possibly apocryphal, but it captures her spirit perfectly. Charles hasn't officially given Nell's first son a title yet. Nell is playing with the boy one day when Charles visits. She calls out loudly, "Come, here, you little bastard." Charles, shocked, asks what she's doing. Nell replies sweetly, "Your Majesty has given me no other name to call him." Charles gets the message shortly after the boy is created Duke of St. Albans. Nell had made her point with characteristic bluntness. But here's what's interesting. Unlike the other mistresses, Nell never received a title herself. Barbara became Duchess of Cleveland. Louise became Duchess of Portsmouth. Nell. She remained plain Nell Gwynn, mistress of the king, until the day she died. And you know what? She didn't care. She didn't need a duchess title to know her worth. She had something more valuable, genuine affection from both Charles and the English people. She was also, by all accounts, genuinely loyal to Charles in a way the others weren't. Barbara had affairs with other men throughout her relationship with Charles. Louise was constantly playing both sides, serving French interests. But now, once she was with Charles, she was with Charles. Contemporary accounts suggest she remained faithful to him from the start of their relationship until his death. Not because she had to, she could have taken other lovers if she'd wanted, but because she genuinely cared for him. And Charles knew it. That's why when he's dying in February 1685, dying of a stroke at age 54, one of his last coherent thoughts is of Nell. Let not poor Nellie starve. He's asking his brother James, who's about to become King James II, to take care of her. Because Charles knows that unlike Barbara or Louise, who've accumulated enough wealth to survive without him. Nell has been less careful with money. She's been generous to others, given to charities, helped old friends from her theater days. She hasn't ruthlessly built a fortune the way the aristocratic mistresses did, and James, to his credit, honors his brother's wishes. He pays off most of Nell's debts, and she had debts, quite a lot of them. He gives her an annual pension of $1,500, which is substantial. He pays off the mortgage on her estate at Bestwood in Nottinghamshire. He makes sure she's comfortable, but Nell doesn't have long to enjoy it. In March 1687, just 2 years after Charles's death, she suffers a stroke, then another. By November, she's dead at age 37. The girl from the brothel, the orange cellar, the actress, the king's beloved mistress, gone. She's buried at St. Martin in the Fields Church in London, and her will shows something beautiful about her character. She leaves $10, zero, to be distributed to the poor and money to release imprisoned debtors from jail every Christmas. Even in death, she's thinking about people like her, people at the bottom, people who need help. Think about what that means. Nell Gwyn rose from absolute poverty to sleeping with the King of England, and she never forgot where she came from. She never pretended to be better than the people she grew up with. She used her position to help others when she could, and she stayed genuine, stayed herself, stayed Pretty Witty Nell until the end. That's why 365 years after her death, we still tell her story with affection. Not because she was the most powerful mistress, she wasn't. Not because she was the wealthiest, she wasn't that either, but because she was real. Because she represented something that people then and now find appealing. The idea that you don't have to change who you are to be loved, that authenticity matters more than pretension, that humor and kindness and loyalty are worth more than titles and estates. And here's the fascinating thing. Nell's success exposes something important about the entire royal mistress system. All these women, Diane, Pompadour, Barbara, Louise, they were playing complex games, adopting sophisticated strategies, building elaborate power structures, and then Nell walks in completely unsophisticated and succeeds by just being herself. It suggests that maybe all that strategy wasn't as necessary as everyone thought. Maybe what these kings really wanted underneath everything else was just someone genuine to talk to. But not every mistress could afford to be genuine. Not everyone had Nell's natural charisma or her ability to charm without trying. For most of these women, survival meant strategy. It meant rivalry. It meant viewing every other woman as a potential threat. And when women with that mindset collided, when ambition met ambition, on strategy, clashed with strategy, the results could be absolutely vicious. You know what's fascinating about human nature? Put two people in a room with unlimited resources and they'll probably get along fine. But tell them that only one of them can have the king's attention, that only one will get the best apartments, that only one will influence the future, and suddenly they become mortal enemies. Now multiply that tension by decades. Add the pressure of an entire court, watching and gossiping. Throw in the fact that your children's futures depend on staying in favor, and you have a recipe for some of the most vicious rivalries in history. Let's start with the longest, slowest burning revenge story ever recorded. Catherine de' Medici versus Dandoyer, 26 years. That's how long Catherine had to watch, smile politely, and pretend she didn't mind that her husband preferred a woman old enough to be his mother. 26 years of seeing Diane wear the crown jewels that should have been hers. 26 years of watching Henry sign documents, Henry Diane, as if Catherine didn't exist. 26 years of humiliation. And Catherine, she played the long game beautifully. She never openly challenged Diane, never made a scene, never gave Henry a reason to choose between them because she knew she'd lose. Instead, she waited. She had 10 children, securing the succession. She built relationships with courtiers who might be useful later. She learned everything about power by watching Diane wield it, and she remembered everything. Contemporary accounts suggest Catherine was actually cordial to Diane, at least on the surface. She understood that making an enemy of the king's mistress would only make her own position worse, so she smiled and was polite and bided her time. And when Henry died in 1559, when Diane lost her protector, Catherine struck with surgical precision. She didn't kill Di. That would have been too obvious, too cruel, and would have reflected badly on Catherine herself. Instead, she destroyed Diane systematically. First, the crown jewels returned immediately. Then Shano, the shadow, Diane loved most, taken and given to Catherine, then banishment from court. Diane was allowed to keep enough wealth to live comfortably in exile. But everything that symbolized power, everything that represented her 25 years as the shadow queen of France, gone, erased, as if it had never been. And here's the psychological brilliance. Catherine didn't let Diane see Henry as he died. Henry called for Diane repeatedly during his final days, but Catherine, as queen, controlled access to the dying king, and she exercised that control ruthlessly. The man who had loved Diane his entire adult life died without saying goodbye to her. That wasn't about protecting the king or following protocol. That was revenge served cold after 26 years of simmering resentment. Can you imagine being Diane in that moment? Knowing the man you've loved for a quarter century is dying, knowing he's asking for you, and being physically prevented from reaching him. That's not just losing power, that's losing everything that made that power meaningful. And Catherine knew exactly what she was doing. Now let's shift to a completely different kind of rivalry. Faster, messier, more chaotic. Barbara Palmer versus literally everyone at Charles Deacon's court. Because Barbara didn't do subtle, she didn't do patient. She fought dirty, fought loud, and fought constantly. When Charles started paying attention to Nell Gwyn in the late 1660s, Barbara saw a threat. Now, you might think, why would a duchess care about an actress? They're in completely different social classes. But that's exactly why Barbara cared. If Charles could be satisfied by a low-born actress with no political connections and expensive tastes, what did he need Barbara for? Nell represented an existential threat to Barbara's entire business model. So Barbara tried to undermine Nell at every opportunity. She spread rumors. She mocked Nell's low birth at court gatherings. She tried to position Nell as a temporary amusement while she, Barbara, was the serious relationship. But here's the problem. Nell was better at this game than Barbara expected. Because Nell didn't fight back directly. She just kept being herself, funny, genuine, unpretentious, and let the contrast speak for itself. When Barbara seemed bitter and grasping, Nell seemed easygoing and fun. Charles noticed, but Barbara's real nemesis wasn't Nell. It was Louise de Caraway, who arrived in 1670 and represented everything Barbara wasn't. Louise was French, aristocratic, sophisticated, younger, and most importantly, she had the backing of Louis XIV of France. This wasn't just a romantic rivalry. This was geopolitics playing out in Charles's bedroom. Louise and Barbara hated each other with a passion that scandalized even the scandal-loving Restoration Court. They fought over apartments, who got better rooms, who lived closer to the king. They competed for gifts, who received more valuable jewels, more lucrative estates. They battled for influence, whose advice would Charles follow, whose friends would get appointments. Contemporary pamphlets and poems document their battles in excruciating detail. One satirical dialogue imagines them arguing with Barbara calling Louise a French spy and Louise calling Barbara a used-up old hag. These weren't private feuds, these were public spectacles. Londoners bought pamphlets about their rivalry, the way people today follow celebrity feuds on social media, this 17th century version of Twitter beef. And here's where it gets deliciously petty. These women would sabotage each other in small CR. Yule ways. There's a possibly apocryphal but widely believed story that Nell Gwyn once fed Moll Davis, another actress, trying to catch Charles's attention laxatives before Moll was supposed to spend an evening with the king. Imagine planning your big romantic night with royalty and, instead, spending it locked in the bathroom. Brutal, hilarious, and totally the kind of thing that would happen in this environment. But let's talk about why these rivalries were so intense. Because it wasn't just about ego or jealousy, it was about survival. Remember, everything these women had depended on the king's continued favor. If he lost interest, if he moved on to someone else, you lost your income, your position, your influence, your children's futures. You couldn't just fade gracefully into the background and start a new career. There was no retirement plan for royal mistresses. You fought to keep what you had because losing meant potentially losing everything. This created an atmosphere of constant paranoia. Every new pretty face at court was a potential threat. Every time the king spoke to another woman, every time he seemed distracted or bored, you had to wonder, is this it? Is this when I get replaced? That kind of stress, maintained over years or even decades, does things to people. It makes them ruthless. It makes them see enemies everywhere. It turns potential allies into competitors. Think about Barbara Palmer's trajectory. She was Charles's first great love, the woman who dominated his early reign. She had 5 children by him, probably. Some historians doubt the paternity of all of them. She was made Duchess of Cleveland. She had wealth beyond imagination. And still, by the 1670s, she's fighting desperately to maintain relevance as younger mistresses arrive. The fear of obsolescence drove her to increasingly desperate behaviors, demanding more money, threatening to publi. Charles's love letters, making scenes at court. And you know what's interesting? The women who lasted longest were the ones who adapted. Pompadour transitioned from lover to confidant and maintained her position for 20 years. Diane evolved from mentor-mistress to indispensable advisor. Even Louis de Caraway, after Charles's death, managed to maintain good relationships with his successors and died comfortably. But Barbara burned so many bridges in her desperate attempts to stay relevant that when Charles died, she was left with wealth but no real allies. She lived another 24 years, but spent them embroiled in lawsuits and scandals. Here's another layer to these rivalries. They often had political dimensions that went beyond personal animosity. When Louis de Caraway and Barbara Palmer fought, they weren't just fighting over a man, they were proxies for larger conflicts. France versus England, Catholic versus Protestant, aristocratic, traditionalism versus new money. People at court chose sides not just based on who they liked personally, but based on whose political agenda aligned with their own interests. This is something we see throughout history, isn't it? Personal conflicts that are really about larger structural issues. Catherine de' Medici versus Diane. D-tier wasn't just about jealousy, it was about legitimacy, about whether royal power should acknowledge and formalize extramarital relationships or pretend they don't exist. Barbara versus Louise wasn't just about who Charles preferred, it was about England's relationship with France, about religious tolerance, about the future direction of the monarchy. And the courtiers, they were making calculations constantly. Do I curry favor with the mistress who seems ascendant now or the one who might last longer? Do I bet on youth and beauty or experience and political acumen? Do I stay loyal to the fading star because loyalty matters, or do I jump ship to the rising one because survival matters more? These weren't abstract questions. Your family's fortune, your children's, marriages, your own position, all could depend on backing the right mistress. Let me paint you a picture of how this played out practically. Let's say you're an ambitious young courtier in Charles II's England in 1675. You need a favor. Maybe you want a military commission or a lucrative government position. You can't just ask the king directly. You're not important enough for a royal audience, so you need an intermediary. But which mistress do you approach? Barbara Palmer is still around, but clearly losing ground. If you tie yourself to her, and she falls completely out of favor, you're tainted by association. Louise de Caraway is powerful and has French backing, but she's also unpopular with English nationalists. If you're seen as her creature, you might gain her support, but lose public respect. Nelwyn is beloved but has no political ambitions, and therefore can't really help you beyond making the king laugh. Which do you choose? There's no clear right answer, and whichever choice you make, you've made enemies of the others. This is the world these women navigated daily. Every conversation was a potential trap. Every alliance was temporary. Every friend might become an enemy if interests shifted. It's exhausting just thinking about it. And yet some women thrived in this environment, the ones who were strategic, enough to build networks, ruthless enough to eliminate threats, and adaptable enough to change tactics when circumstances shifted. But here's what often gets lost in all the drama of rivalries and intrigue. While these women were fighting each other, they were also doing something remarkable. They were exercising real political power in a world that gave women almost no official authority. Yes, they did it through men. Yes, the methods were sometimes unsavory. But they were shaping policy, influencing appointments, directing resources, and affecting the course of their nations. The rivalries were vicious, but they were rivalries between power brokers, not between decorative ornaments. And that's what we need to explore next, just how far that power actually reached. Because these women weren't just whispering sweet nothings in royal ears. They were making decisions that affected wars, economies, and the fates of millions of people who never even knew their names. There's a phrase that gets used a lot when talking about powerful women throughout history: pillow talk. It sounds frivolous, doesn't it? Almost dismissive. Like these women were just chatting idly after sex, maybe mentioning a name here or there, nothing serious. But let me tell you what pillow talk actually meant in practice. It meant the difference between war and peace. It meant generals getting promoted or fired. It meant policies that affected millions of lives. Pillow talk wasn't gossip. It was statecraft conducted in the most intimate setting imaginable. Let's start with something concrete. The year is 1558. King Henry II of France needs to make a decision about who should command his armies in the ongoing wars with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. This isn't a small decision. The wrong general could lose battles, lose territory, lose France's position as a European power. Henry has several candidates, each backed by different noble families, each with their own political agendas. Who does Henry consult? His ministers, sure. His military advisors, of course. But after all the official meetings are done, after all the formal recommendations are made, Henri retires to his private chambers. And there, away from the political theater of court, he talks to Dander Patier. She knows these men. She's spoken with them, assessed them, understood their strengths and weaknesses. She's also politically astute enough to understand the implications of each choice, which noble families will be pleased, which will feel slighted, how the balance of power at court will shift. Contemporary ambassadors documented this. The Venetian ambassador to France wrote dispatches back to Venice, describing how decisions made in official council meetings during the day would sometimes be reversed after Henry spent the evening with Diane. She was in effect functioning as an unofficial chief advisor. She didn't command armies or sign treaties, but she influenced the man who did. And in a monarchy, that's the same thing. Now, here's what makes this so powerful and so problematic at the same time. Diane had influence without accountability. If a minister makes a bad decision, he can be dismissed, impeached, held responsible. But Diane, she held no official position. She couldn't be removed through any formal process. Her power existed in the shadows, which made it both more flexible and more dangerous. She could advocate for policies that benefited her personally without anyone being able to challenge her directly. For example, remember that tax on government appointments, épaulé, that Henry granted her. Every time someone got appointed to a position in the military, the church, or civil service, Diane got paid. This meant Diane had a direct financial interest in who got appointed, and she had daily access to the man making those appointments. Can you see the conflict of interest? She wasn't just advising on who should get positions, she was profiting from those positions being filled. It's the kind of thing that, in a modern democracy, would lead to congressional investigations. In 16th century France, it was just how things worked. But let's talk about Barbara Palmer in England, because her political influence took a different form. Barbara didn't care much about policy. She wasn't interested in military strategy or diplomatic negotiations. But she understood something equally important. Personnel is policy. If you control who gets into positions of power, you control what those positions do. Barbara became a political broker. Men who wanted access to Charles II came to Barbara first. She would arrange audiences, make introductions, put in good words, and in exchange, sometimes money, sometimes favors, sometimes just the satisfaction of placing her people in positions of influence. Henry Bennet, who became the Earl of Arlington and one of Charles's most important ministers, gained much of his early access to the king through Barbara's support. She recognized his potential, vouched for him, and helped him climb the ladder. And once he was in a position of power, he remembered who helped him get there. This is real power. Not the power to command armies directly, but the power to choose who commands them. Not the power to write laws, but the power to decide who gets to write them. It's the kind of influence that's hard to measure, but impossible to ignore. Now, let's talk about Madame de Pompadour, because she took political involvement to a level that even Diane and Barbara hadn't reached. Pompadour didn't just influence decisions, she made them. Foreign ambassadors didn't just bring gifts to the king, they negotiated directly with Pompadour. When the Austrian ambassador wanted to shift France's alliances in the 1750s, he worked through Pompadour. She was the one who convinced Louis X to abandon France's traditional enmity with Austria and form an alliance against Prussia. This is called the Diplomatic Revolution, and it completely reshaped European politics. For centuries, France and Austria had been enemies. The Habsburg-Bourbon rivalry was one of the defining features of European geopolitics, and then, largely through Pompadour's influence, they became allies. This led directly to the 7 Years' War, which became a global conflict involving Europe, North America, India, and the Caribbean. And it started in no small part because of conversations happening in the private apartments of the King of France's mistress. Now, historians debate exactly how much influence Pompadour really had. Some argue she was just a conduit for ideas that Louis XV already supported. Others argue she was the driving force behind French foreign policy in the 1750s. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but here's what we know for certain. Contemporary observers believe she had immense influence. The English ambassador wrote that she was a de facto prime minister. Prussian diplomats complained that they couldn't get anywhere without going through Pompadour. Whether she was actually making decisions or just perceived as making them, the practical effect was the same. She had power. And when France lost the 7 Years' War, when they lost Canada and most of their possessions in India, guess who got blamed? Not just the generals who lost battles, not just the ministers who planned strategy. Pompadour. Pamphlets circulated calling her a warmonger, accusing her of leading France to ruin for her own vanity. The criticism was often misogynistic and unfair, but it reveals something important. People believed she had the power to influence these events, and belief in power often functions the same as actual power. But here's where we need to pause and ask a harder question. Was this actually power, or was it just influence? What's the difference? Power is the ability to make things happen, directly. Influence is the ability to convince someone else to make them happen. These mistresses had influence, sometimes tremendous influence, but they didn't have power in the formal sense. They couldn't issue orders that would be obeyed. They couldn't sign laws or command armies. Everything they accomplished had to go through the king. This distinction matters because it reveals the fundamental vulnerability of their position. As long as the king valued their opinion, they could shape policy, but the moment he stopped listening, they had nothing, no legal authority to fall back on, no institutional position to protect them. They wielded influence without power, which made them simultaneously formidable and fragile. Think about it this way. A prime minister might lose the king's favor, but they still have the office of prime minister with its own authority and responsibilities. A royal mistress loses the king's favor. She has nothing. Her entire political existence depended on maintaining one personal relationship. That's an incredibly precarious foundation for influence over matters of state, and yet, despite this vulnerability, or maybe because of it, these women became extraordinarily skilled at reading people, at understanding motivations, at anticipating how decisions would play out. They had to be. They didn't have institutional support or formal training. They couldn't fall back on bureaucratic procedures or official hierarchies. They had to rely entirely on their own judgment, their own political instincts, their own ability to navigate complex human relationships. In some ways, this made them better at certain kinds of political work than the official ministers. Ministers were constrained by protocol, by formal procedures, by the need to maintain their official dignity. Mistresses could have informal conversations. They could test ideas without commitment. They could speak candidly in ways that ministers communicating through official channels could not. The king could say things to his mistress that he'd never say in a council meeting. Doubts, fears, half-formed ideas that needed to be worked through before becoming policy. Let me give you a specific example of how this worked. In 1757, France is doing badly in the 7 Years' War. Louis X is depressed, uncertain, questioning his own judgment. His ministers are telling him what they think he wants to hear, giving him carefully calibrated advice designed to protect their own positions. But Pompadour, she can tell him the truth. She can say, this general is incompetent, this strategy isn't working, you need to make changes. She can say it privately without making him lose face publicly, and because she has no official position to protect, no constituency to satisfy her, advice can be more direct, more honest. Does this mean her advice was always good? No. She was human. She made mistakes. She sometimes pursued her own interests. But the point is, she could function as a kind of unofficial advisor in ways that complemented the official political system. She filled gaps that formal institutions couldn't address. Now, was this a good system? That's a different question. From a modern perspective, it's clearly problematic. Unelected, unaccountable individuals shouldn't have this kind of influence over state policy. We've developed democratic institutions specifically to prevent this kind of informal power from corrupting governance. But in an absolute monarchy, where the king's personal judgment was the ultimate authority anyway, having a trusted confidant who could speak honestly might have actually improved decisioning. Here's another dimension of their political power that often gets overlooked: patronage. These women controlled access to enormous resources, money, positions, opportunities, and they used this control to build networks of loyalty. Dando Potier supported artists like Philippe and poets like Ronard. Pompadour patronized Voltaire and the encyclopedists. Barbara Palmer helped place her relatives in lucrative positions. This wasn't just cultural philanthropy. This was political strategy. When you support someone's career, they remember. When you commission someone's work, you create a relationship. When you help someone achieve their ambitions, you earn their loyalty. These mistresses were building coalitions of supporters who would speak well of them, defend them from criticism, and support their interests at court. It's the same kind of network building that successful politicians do today, just operating through different channels. And sometimes their influence extended beyond their own counter. Louis de Caraway wasn't just Charles Steur's mistress. She was a French agent. Louis XIV sent her to England specifically to influence Charles's foreign policy toward a pro-French stance. She reported back to France regularly. She advocated for policies that benefited Louis XIV. She was conducting espionage under the cover of a romantic relationship, and Charles knew it. Everyone knew it. And yet, Louise remained influential for years because Charles valued what she brought to the relationship, even knowing she was serving French interests. Think about what that means. A king was willing to keep a mistress who was literally spying for a foreign power because the personal and political benefits of the relationship outweighed the security risks. That's a calculation. That seems almost impossible to imagine today. But in the 17th century, personal relationships between monarchs and their courts operated by different rules. So, when we ask how much power did these women really have, the answer is, depends on how you measure power. Did they command armies? No. Did they sign laws? No. Did they hold official positions? Rarely. But did they influence who got appointed to command armies? Yes. Did they shape the thinking that led to laws? Yes. Did they function as unofficial advisors with real impact on policy? Absolutely. They existed in a gray zone between formal powerlessness and practical influence. And in that gray zone, they found ways to affect history that we're still trying to understand. But their influence wasn't limited to politics and war. These women also shaped culture, art, and intellectual life in ways that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. That's the legacy we need to explore next. Walk through the streets of Paris today, right now in 2025, and you'll see buildings that wouldn't exist without royal mistresses. Visit the Louvre and you'll find porcelain that was created because a king's lover wanted France to compete with China. Open a philosophy book and you might be reading ideas that survived only because a woman with no official title protected the people who wrote them. The scandal fades, the gossip dies, but the art, the architecture, the intellectual legacy, that lasts forever. Here's something that might surprise you. When historians tally up Madame de Pompadour's contributions to France, the political stuff, the wars, the diplomatic, maneuvering, all that drama we just talked about, that's actually not what she's most remembered for. What she's remembered for is this: she fundamentally shaped French culture during one of its most creative periods. The art, architecture, and intellectual life of mid-18th century France bears her fingerprints everywhere. Let's start with something concrete you can still see today: the Place de la Concorde in the heart of Paris, one of the most famous public squares in the world, where the guillotine stood during the Revolution, where the Luxor obelisk now rises. That was originally called the Place Louis XV, and Pompadour was instrumental in its creation. She worked with her brother, the Marquis Marini, who she'd gotten appointed as director of royal buildings naturally, and together was the king. They planned this massive public space designed to celebrate the monarchy. But it wasn't just about ego or propaganda. Pompadour understood something that forward-thinking leaders understand. Great public spaces elevate everyone. They become gathering places, symbols of civic pride, locations where history happens. When you create beautiful public architecture, you're investing in cultural capital that pays dividends for centuries. And she was right. The Place de Concorde has been central to Pisan life for almost 300 years. Then there's the École de Tir, the military academy that trained Napoleon Bonaparte, among thousands of other officers who shaped French and European history. Pompadour pushed for its creation and worked with her brother to see it built. This wasn't just a building. It was an institution that professionalized military education in France, that created standardized training for officers, that helped France compete militarily with other European powers. That's nation building, That's infrastructure. That's the kind of legacy that transcends personal scandal. And the Petit Trianolon at Versailles, that jewel-box palace that would later become Marie Antoinette's favorite retreat. Pompadour commissioned it, though she died before it was completed. She worked with the architect Jean-Jacques Gabriel to create this perfect little building in the neoclassical style. It's considered one of the finest examples of French architecture from that period. Tourists visit it today and rarely know that it exists because a former fish merchant's daughter decided France needed more beautiful buildings. But here's where Pompadour's legacy gets really interesting. The Serre porcelain manufactory. In the 1750s, Chinese and Japanese porcelain were luxury goods that European aristocrats paid enormous sums to own. The secret of making hard paste porcelain was closely guarded. European manufacturers could make soft paste porcelain, but it wasn't as fine, as durable, as beautiful as Asian porcelain. Pompadour saw this as both a cultural and economic problem. Why should France be dependent on imports for luxury goods? Why shouldn't French artisans be the best in the world? In 1756, she helped establish a royal porcelain manufactory at Sèvres near her residence at Bellevue. She gave it royal patronage, protected it financially, and ensured it had the best artists and craftsmen. She commissioned pieces herself, setting trends that aristocrats across Europe rushed to follow, and it wove. RKD. Sèvres porcelain became and still is some of the finest porcelain in the world. Museums display it. Collectors pay fortunes for it. The company still exists today, still making porcelain, still bearing the name of the town where Pompadour established it almost 270 years ago. That's not just patronage. That's creating an entire industry that outlives you by centuries. Now let's talk about the intellectuals, because this is where Pompadour's legacy gets truly radical. Remember, this is the age of enlightenment. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot are questioning everything: religious dogma, political authority, social hierarchies. They're writing things that challenge the very basis of the old order. And the Catholic Church and conservative nobility want them silenced. Pompadour protected them. She convinced Louis XV to appoint Voltaire as royal historiographer in 1745, giving him apartments at Versailles and a salary. This wasn't just kindness, this was strategic cultural investment. Voltaire was already famous, already controversial. By bringing him into the royal orbit, Pompadour was making a statement. The French crown values intellectual achievement, values Enlightenment ideas, values progress over tradition, but even more importantly, she protected the encyclopedia. This massive project by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent Dallon aimed to catalog all human knowledge in one place. It challenged religious superstition with scientific thinking. It questioned political authority. It suggested that reason, not tradition or divine right, should guide human affairs. The Catholic Church wanted it banned. Conservative courtiers wanted it stopped. But Pompadour convinced Louis XI to allow its publication in 1751. Do you understand what that means? The ideas in the encyclopedia, ideas about reason, about science, about questioning authority, those ideas fed directly into the Enlightenment philosophy that would decades later inspire the French Revolution. Pompadour died in 1764, 25 years before the Revolution began. She had no idea she was protecting the intellectual seeds that would eventually topple the entire system she was part of. But she was doing it anyway because she believed in knowledge, in progress, in the power of ideas. When Voltaire heard of her death in 1764, he wrote, "I am very sad at the death of Madame de Pompadour. I was indebted to her, and I mourn her out of gratitude." That's not just a polite obituary. That's genuine grief from one of the greatest minds of the age for a woman who protected and promoted intellectual freedom. Now let's shift to Diane de Poitiers, because her cultural legacy is different but equally impressive. Diane was a patron of the French Renaissance. She commissioned the Château d'Anne from Philippe Dom, who was the greatest architect of his generation. This wasn't just a house, it was a statement about what French Renaissance architecture could achieve. Delorme incorporated classical Roman elements, mathematical proportions, innovative, engineering. Much of it has been destroyed over the centuries, but what remains shows the ambition and sophistication of the project. Diane also patronized poets, most notably Pierre de Ronsard, who was part of a group called Laude, poets who are transforming French poetry by incorporating classical Greek and Roman forms. Ronsard wrote verses praising Diane, comparing her to Diana the Huntress, celebrating her beauty and wisdom. This wasn't just flattery, this was collaboration between patron and artist that elevated French literature. And Jean Goujon, one of the most important sculptors of the French Renaissance, created works for Diane's chateau and other projects she sponsored. His sculptures are in museums today, studied by art historians, admired by millions. They exist because Dion P. Otier had the wealth, the vision, and the taste to commission them. Here's what's fascinating about both Diane and Pompadour as patrons. They had impeccable taste. They didn't just throw money at artists randomly. They identified the best talent, supported innovative work, and shaped aesthetic movements. The raku style, elegant, light, decorative, playful, that's associated with Pompadour's era, partly because she promoted it. She influenced fashion, interior design, decorative arts. Women across Europe copied her style, wanted apartments decorated like hers, sought the same porcelain and paintings she collected. This is soft power in its purest form, not commanding armies, not writing laws, but shaping what people think is beautiful, what they aspire to own, how they imagine refinement and sophistication. That influence ripples through culture for generations. Even Nell Gwyn, who had no pretensions to high culture, left a cultural legacy. She helped legitimize actresses as a profession in England. Before women could perform on stage legally, acting was seen as disreputable for women. Nell's success, her popularity, the fact that she could go from the stage to the king's bed and be celebrated rather than condemned, that shifted perceptions. She proved that an actress could be respectable, could be beloved, could be someone worth celebrating. The English theatre scene that flourished in the late 1600s, that produced playwrights and performers who influenced English drama for centuries. Nell was part of making that possible. She wasn't a patron of the arts in the way Pompadour was, but she was a practitioner, and her success opened doors for other women in theatre. Now, here's a question worth considering. Why did these women invest so much in cultural patronage? Part of it was certainly personal taste. They liked beautiful things, appreciated art and architecture. Part of it was strategic. Being known as a patron elevated their status, gave them prestige beyond their role as mistress. But I think there's something deeper. These women knew their power was temporary. They knew they'd be remembered as the king's mistress with all the moral judgment that entailed. But if they could also be remembered as patrons who created something lasting, something beautiful, something that contributed to their nation's cultural glory, that was a different kind of immortality. They were building monuments not just to the kings they loved, but to themselves, and it worked. When you visit the Petitrian, you're visiting Pompadour's vision made real. When you see Sèvres porcelain in a museum, you're seeing the result of her economic and cultural strategy. When you read Voltaire or Diderot, you're reading ideas she helped protect. The scandal of her relationship with Louis the Fiend, that's historical gossip, but her cultural contributions, that's history itself. This matters because it changes how we evaluate these women. If we only see them as sexual partners to powerful men, we miss most of the story. They were cultural architects, institution builders, tastemakers who shaped their societies in ways that lasted long after the kings they slept with were dead and forgotten. But even as they were shaping culture and politics, there were other women watching, suffering, powerless. The queens, the wives, The women who wore the crowns but not the influence. Their stories are different, darker, and in many ways even more tragic. Imagine being told from childhood that you're going to be a queen. Imagine the preparation, the education, the excitement. You'll wear a crown, you'll live in a palace, you'll be the most important woman in the kingdom, and then you arrive at your new country, marry your king, and discover that none of it was true. You have the title, yes, you wear the crown at ceremonies, but the real queen, the woman who shares the king's bed, his secrets, his heart, that's someone else, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. This is the story history doesn't like to tell. We talk about the glamorous mistresses, the powerful women who shaped nations. But what about the women who were pushed aside? The wives who had to smile and pretend they didn't notice? The queens who learned that their most important job, being the king's companion, had been outsourced to someone else? Let's start with Catherine de' Medici, because her suffering was both the longest and in some ways the most psychologically complex. She arrives in France in 1533, at age 14, married to 14-year-old Henri. She's from one of the most powerful families in Europe, the Medicis of Florence, bankers to popes and kings, patrons of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. She's educated, cultured, politically astute. She should have been a formidable queen. But there's a problem. Actually, several problems. First, Henry is already in love with Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years older than him. Second, Catherine doesn't get pregnant. Year after year goes by. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and still no children. In a royal marriage, this is a catastrophe. Catherine's only real job is producing heirs, and she's failing. The whispers start. Maybe she's barren. Maybe the marriage should be annulled. Maybe Henry should find a new wife who can actually give him children. Catherine lives with this terror for a decade. Every month that she doesn't conceive is another month closer to being sent home in disgrace, her marriage dissolved, her purpose as queen erased, and meanwhile Diane is there every day. More beautiful apartments than Catherine's, more influence than Catherine has, more time with Henry than Catherine gets. Catherine watches as her husband cares Diane on royal tours instead of her. She watches as Diane receives jewels that should be Catherine's. She watches as Henry signs documents, Henry Diane, as if his wife doesn't exist. But here's where it gets truly heartbreaking. According to some historical accounts, Diane actually helps Catherine. She gives her advice on how to seduce Henri, how to please him, how to increase her chances of getting pregnant. Can you imagine how humiliating that must have been? Your husband's mistress giving you tips on how to sleep with your own husband. There's that famous story, possibly exaggerated, but rooted in real desperation, about Catherine drilling holes in the floor above Diane's bedroom so she could spy on them having sex. She's literally watching her husband with another woman to learn how to satisfy him herself. Think about the psychology of that, the degradation, the complete erasure of her dignity as a wife, let alone as a queen. And then finally in 1543, Catherine gets pregnant. In 1544, she gives birth to a son, Francis. The pressure releases. She's proven she can bear children. Over the next 11 years, she has 9 more children, almost constantly pregnant throughout the 1540s and 1550s. She's done her duty. She's secured the succession. Surely now Henry will value her more, right? No, even after giving him 10 children, even after proving her fertility beyond any doubt, Henry still prefers Diane. Catherine has done literally everything expected of her as a queen, produced multiple heirs, managed the household, behaved with dignity, and it doesn't matter. She's still second best in her own marriage. For 26 years, Catherine lives in this shadow. 26 years of watching another woman occupy the place that should be hers. 26 years of swallowing her pride, maintaining her composure and waiting, just waiting, because she understands something important. She's younger, and Diane. Henry is younger than Diane. The mathematics of mortality are on Catherine's side. Eventually something will change. She just has to outlast them. And she does. When Henry dies in 1559, Catherine finally gets her revenge. But by then, she's 40 years old. She spent more than half her life as the ignored queen. The psychological damage from that kind of long-term humiliation doesn't just disappear because you finally have power. It shapes who you become. And the Catherine de' Medici who emerges after Henry's death, ruthless, controlling, paranoid, that's partly a product of 26 years of powerless suffering. Now let's cross the channel to England and talk about Catherine of Banza, because her story is different but equally tragic. She marries Charles II in 1662, a Portuguese princess brought to England as part of a political alliance. She brings a massive dowry, money, territories, trading rights that help England's economy. She's Catholic, which is politically complicated in Protestant England. But she's also reportedly kind, gentle, and genuinely fond of Charles. And Charles. He's already involved with Barbara Palmer, and within months of his marriage, he is also sleeping with other women. Catherine is introduced to Barbara shortly after the wedding, and initially refuses to accept her as a lady-in-waiting. She crosses Barbara's name off the list. She cries. She has what we might now recognize as a panic, attack, or breakdown, but she has no power. Charles insists, and eventually, Catherine has to accept that her husband's mistress will be part of her daily household. Here's what makes Catherine's situation particularly painful. She can't have children, or at least she can't carry pregnancies to term. She suffers multiple miscarriages. Meanwhile, Charles is fathering children left and right with his mistresses, at least 12 acknowledged, illegitimate children. The message is clear. The problem isn't Charles's fertility, it's Catherine's. So she's not only dealing with the humiliation of her husband's very public affairs, but also the failure to do the one thing a queen must do, produce an heir. She's in an impossible position. She can't divorce. That's not how royal marriages work. She can't escape the situation. She can't even complain publicly because that would make her look bad. Not Charles. And you know what Catherine does? She adapts. She becomes friends with some of Charles's mistresses, particularly Nell Gwynn. There are accounts of Catherine and Nell having cordial relationships, even playing cards together. Is this genuine friendship, or is it survival strategy? If you can't beat them, join them. Probably both. Catherine finds a way to exist in this impossible situation by accepting what she cannot change. When Charles dies in 1685, Catherine doesn't remarry. She doesn't return to Portugal immediately. She stays in England for years, living quietly, practicing her Catholic faith, doing charitable work. She eventually returns to Portugal and lives until 1705, surviving Charles by 20 years. But she never has children. She never knows what it feels like to be the most important woman in her husband's life. She spends her marriage as a supporting character in someone else's story. Then there's Marie Leczinska, wife of Louis XV, and the Queen during Pompadour's reign. Marie's story is interesting because she actively withdraws from the sexual aspect of her marriage. Between 1727 and 1737, she gives Louis 10 children, 10 pregnancies in 10 years. And then she tells him no more. She's done. She's risked her life in childbirth 10 times. She's produced heirs and spares and backup spares. She's fulfilled her obligation, and now she wants to focus on prayer and religion. Louis respects this. He doesn't force himself on his wife, but he's a man in his 22nd and 32nd with normal sexual desires, so he takes mistresses. First the Duchess Chaturu, then Pompadour, then others. And Marie, who created this situation by withdrawing from the marriage bed, has to live with the consequences. But here's what's interesting about Marie. She doesn't seem to have been as tormented by this as Catherine de' Medici was. She's 8 years older than Louis, more religiously devout, and apparently content to focus on her children and her spiritual life. She maintains cordial relations with Pompadour, not friendship exactly, but professional courtesy. When Pompadour becomes her lady-in-waiting in 1756, Maria accepts this bizarre arrangement without recorded complaint. Is this dignity, resignation, or something else? It's hard to know. Marie leaves fewer personal writings than Catherine de' Medici, so we have less insight into her inner life. But the fact that she lives to 1768, surviving both Louisiosa and Pompadour, and maintains her position as queen throughout suggests she found some way to make peace with her situation. These three women, Catherine de' Medici, Catherine of Bananza, Marie Lajinska, all responded differently to similar situations. One waited for revenge, one adapted, and found friendship where she could. One withdrew and focused on religion, but all three had to accept a fundamental reality. In the contest between queen and mistress, the mistress usually won the king's heart. Why? Why would kings consistently prefer their mistresses to their wives? Part of it is the element of choice we talked about earlier. Mistresses chose to be there. Wives were assigned. But there's something else too. Queens came with obligations. Queens were public figures who had to maintain dignity, who were watched and judged constantly, who represented the monarchy itself. You couldn't be completely yourself with the queen because she was always, on some level, performing her role. But with a mistress, you could relax. You could be human. You could admit doubts and fears and desires without worrying about how it would look. The mistress saw you as a person, not just as a king. That intimacy, that permission to be flawed and human was probably worth more than any political advantage. Still, spare a thought for these queens. They didn't ask to be bargaining chips in political marriages. They didn't choose to be married to men who would publicly prefer other women. They were doing their best in situations largely beyond their control, maintaining dignity in circumstances designed to strip them of it. And some of them, like Catherine de' Medici, eventually got their chance to exercise power. When Henry died, Catherine became regent for her sons and ruled France for decades, arguably more effectively than Henry ever had. The suffering queen became the powerful dagger, but even that victory was bittersweet. She had power finally, but only because the people she'd loved or tried to love were gone. But here's something we haven't talked about yet. Something that complicates this whole story even further, the children. Because these arrangements didn't just affect the kings and queens and mistresses, they produced a generation of royal bastards. Children born outside marriage, acknowledged by their fathers, raised in palaces but denied the crown. Their lives tell yet another dimension of this complex story. There's a particular kind of cruelty in being born almost royal. You grow up in palaces. You're surrounded by luxury. Your father is the king. Everyone knows it, acknowledges it. But that one word, illegitimate, means you can never inherit the throne. You're close enough to power to taste it, but forever barred from actually holding it. And your entire existence is a walking reminder of your father's infidelity, your others' scandal, and the messy reality that monarchs are just humans with human desires. Charles II of England holds a distinction that no other English monarch can claim. He had more acknowledged illegitimate children than any king before or since, at least 12, possibly more. And here's what's remarkable. He didn't hide them. He embraced them. He gave them titles, money, positions, love. He created an entire parallel aristocracy of his bastard children, and they became some of the most important people in England. Let's start with James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, because his story is both triumphant and tragic. James was born in 1649 in Rotterdam during Charles's exile. His mother was Lucy Walter, a Welsh woman who followed Charles during his years wandering Europe. Before the Restoration, James was Charles's first son. And for a while he was also Charles's only son because, remember, Catherine of Banza couldn't carry pregnancies to term. This created a situation that was politically explosive. Here was a healthy, handsome Protestant son of the king. He just happened to be illegitimate. Charles adored him, gave him the title Duke of Monmouth, married him to a wealthy heirs, made him Captain General of the army. Monmouth was everything an heir should be except legitimate. And some people wondered, what if Charles had secretly married Lucy Walter during exile? What if Monmouth was actually legitimate and just couldn't prove it? These rumors circulated for years. Charles repeatedly denied them. He insisted Monmouth was a bastard and could never inherit the throne. But the rumors wouldn't die because too many people wanted them to be true. A Protestant heir versus Charles's Catholic brother, James. Many in England preferred the bastard son to the legitimate Catholic heir. When Charles died in 1685, Monmouth tried to claim the throne. He led a rebellion against his uncle, now King James II. It failed spectacularly. Monmouth was captured, brought before James, and executed. He was 36 years old, the son who'd grown up in palaces, who'd been one of the most powerful men in England, who'd commanded armies, beheaded as a traitor. All because of the accident of his birth and his own ambition. But not all of Charles's bastards met tragic ends. Charles Beauclerk, Duke of St. Albans, Nelwyn's son, lived to be 56 and founded a ducal line that still exists today. His descendants include Diana, Princess of Wales. Yes, Princess Diana was a direct descendant of Nell Gwyn, the orange seller turned royal mistress. Think about that lineage. From the lowest rungs of society to the mother of a future king, connected through centuries by that original, illegitimate relationship. And Charles Fitzroy, Duke of Southampton, son of Barbara Palmer, also founded a ducal line. And Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, another of Barbara's sons. And Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, Louis Derouet's son. Charles II essentially created a new tier of aristocracy through his illegitimate children. These weren't hidden embarrassments. They were prominent members of the court, married into other noble families, held positions of real power. But here's what's interesting. While they had wealth, titles, and status, they could never be king. That line was absolute. Illegitimate children were excluded from succession no matter how much their father loved them. This was about maintaining the principle that monarchy passed through lawful marriage. Allowing bastards to inherit would undermine the entire system. In France, the situation was similar but handled differently. Henry the Skek had children with Danda, Poyet. Actually, no. There's no documented evidence that Diane bore Henry any children, but Henry did have an illegitimate daughter, Diane de France, with another woman before his relationship with Diane de Poitiers began. And interestingly, Diane de Poitiers helped raise this child who was named after her. The girl grew up at court, was married to a duke, and lived a comfortable life as a recognized royal bastard, the illegitimate children of Louis X, 15th. And there were several from his various affairs, were typically legitimized, given titles, and married into nobility. They weren't hidden away. They were acknowledged, provided for, integrated into aristocratic society, but they couldn't inherit the throne. That distinction was crucial. Now, think about what it must have been like to be one of these children. You grow up knowing your father is the king. You see your legitimate half-siblings, the children of the queen, and you know that they're real princes and princesses, while you're what? Special, privileged, but not quite legitimate. You have your father's name, his affection, his support, but there's always that barrier, that invisible line you can't cross. Some handled it well. Charles B. Clark, Duke of St. Albans, seemed content with his position. He served in various official capacities, managed his estates, lived a long life. He never tried to claim the throne or challenge the succession. He accepted his place in the hierarchy. But Monmouth couldn't accept it. Maybe because he was the oldest. Maybe because he was genuinely talented and charismatic and could see himself as king. Maybe because enough other people told him he should be king that he started to believe it. Whatever the reason, he couldn't make peace with being the almost heir, the might-have-been king, and it destroyed him. Here's another dimension to consider. The mothers. These women, the royal mistresses, had to watch their children grow up with this stigma. They'd given The king children, which in any normal relationship would be the ultimate bond, the ultimate security. But these children were labeled bastards. They were legally inferior to the queen's children, and there was nothing the mothers could do about it except try to secure the best possible futures for them through titles, marriages, and money. Nelwyn was particularly determined about this. Remember that story about her calling her son little bastard in front of Charles until he gave the boy a proper title? That wasn't just Nell being cheeky. That was a mother fighting for her child's status and security. She knew she couldn't make him legitimate, but she could make damn sure he was a duke, and Barbara Palmer had multiple children by Charles, 5 that he acknowledged, though historians debate the paternity of some. She fought ruthlessly to ensure all of them got titles, advantageous marriages, and financial security. This wasn't just greed. This was a mother trying to protect her children's futures in a world that would always see them as lesser because of the circumstances of their birth. Think about the psychology of these children as they grew up. You're raised in luxury, but you're constantly reminded that you're different. You attend court functions, but you're not quite part of the royal family. You have noble titles, but everyone knows how you got them. Some people resent you as symbols of the king's adultery. Others try to use you to get to your father. You're simultaneously privileged and stigmatized. And what about their relationships with their legitimate half-siblings, the queen's children? Were they friends, rivals? Did they play together as children? Did they resent each other? The historical record is mostly silent on these questions, but imagine the dynamics. If you're a legitimate prince, how do you feel about your illegitimate half-bros who have your father's love but not your claim to the throne? If you're an illegitimate duke, how do you feel about your legitimate half-brother who's going to be king someday simply because his mother was the right woman? Here's a fascinating detail. When Charles II died, several of his bastard sons attended his deathbed. They were there, with his wife Catherine, mourning their father, the king. This wasn't hidden away. This was public acknowledgement of their relationship to him. Charles had normalized these illegitimate children to such an extent that no one thought it strange they'd be at the dying king's bedside, but the price of this normalization was political instability, because as long as there were vigorous Protestant adult bastards around, there would be people who preferred them to the legitimate Catholic heir. Monmouth's rebellion wasn't just one man's ambition. It was the logical conclusion of a system that created powerful, illegitimate royal children, and then forbade them from inheriting. After the disaster of Monmouth's rebellion, future English monarchs were more careful. George the Burn, George II, George III. They all had illegitimate children, but they weren't elevated to the same prominence that Charles the Sene's bastards had enjoyed. The lesson was learned. Don't create royal bastards so powerful that they think they could be king. But in the immediate aftermath, in the families of those dukes and earls that Charles created, the legacy continued. These families intermarried with other aristocratic families. Their descendants became some of the most important people in British society. The blood of royal mistresses, Nell Gwyn, Barbara Palmer, Louise Dere flows through the veins of numerous modern aristocratic families. And here's something that might surprise you. This legacy continues today. The current Duke of St. Albans is a direct male line descendant of Nell Gwyn and Charles Sand. The Duke of Richmond and Gordon descends from Louis Caraway. The Duke of Grafton descends from Barbara Palmer. These aren't ancient historical curiosities. These are living people, members of the British aristocracy in 2025, who exist because royal mistresses bore children to a king 365 years ago. So when we ask what was the legacy of royal mistresses, part of the answer is literal genetic legacy. Descendants who carry their genes forward through centuries, children who were both blessed and cursed by their parentage, given every advantage except the one that mattered most in a monarchy, legitimacy. But beyond genetics, beyond titles and lineages, what did all of this mean? What can we learn from these stories that's relevant to us today in a world where kings no longer reign and mistresses are called something else? That's the question we need to grapple with as we bring this journey to its Conclusion. June 30th, 1559. A jousting tournament in Paris. King Henry II of France, 40 years old in his prime, wearing the black and white colors of Dion Poitiers. The lance splinters. The fragment pierces his eye. And in that moment, everything changes. Not just for Henry, who will die in agony 10 days later, but for Diane, who's about to discover that 25 years of power can evaporate in a single heartbeat. This is the moment every royal mistress feared, the death of the king, because with very rare exceptions, when the king died, the mistress's power died with him. All that influence, all that wealth, all that carefully constructed authority, it was built on sand, and the tide was about to come in. Catherine de' Medici has been waiting for this moment for 26 years. She's been patient, dignified, humiliated, but composed. And now, finally, her time has come. Henry is dying. He's calling for Diane repeatedly, wanting to see the woman he's loved his entire adult life one more time. But Catherine, as queen, controls access to the dying king, and she denies it. Diane will not see Henry as he dies. After a quarter century together, they'll have no goodbye. Can you imagine being Diane in those 10 days? Knowing the man you've loved is dying in agony, knowing he's asking for you and being physically prevented from reaching him by the woman you replaced so many years ago. That's not just losing power. That's losing everything that made life meaningful. And it's only the beginning. Henry dies on July 10th. The moment he's gone, Catherine strikes. First, a letter demanding the return of the crown jewels, all of them, immediately. These jewels that Henry gave Diane that she's worn for years as symbols of her position. Catherine wants them back, and Diane has no choice but to comply. She has no protector anymore. The new king is Henry and Catherine's teenage son. Francis II, he answers to his mother, not to his late father's mistress. Then Catherine demands Charlot, the beautiful shadow spanning the river share that Henry had given Diane, that Diane had lovingly renovated. Catherine had wanted that shadow for years. Now she'll have it. She offers Diane the Château de Chaumont in exchange, a less desirable property, a clear downgrade. It's not a negotiation, it's a diktat, and Diane, understanding the precariousness of her position, accepts. Finally, the banishment. Diane is ordered to leave the court. She can't return to Paris or Versailles without permission. The woman who'd walked through Versailles, like a queen who'd received foreign ambassadors who'd influenced policy for a quarter century, exiled to her estates. She's allowed to keep enough wealth to live comfortably. Catherine isn't completely vindictive, but everything that symbolized power, stripped away, erased. Diane lived 6 more years at the Château dying in 1566 at age 66. She fell from her horse, still riding, still active, still maintaining the physical vigor that had been part of her mystique. But those final 6 years must have been strange, quiet, empty in a way, going from being one of the most powerful women in Europe to being essentially erased from public life, all because the man whose heartbeat sustained her power stopped breathing. Now, let's look at what happened to Barbara Palmer when Charles II died. Barbara's situation was different from Diane's because by 1685 she'd already lost most of her influence. Charles had moved on to other mistresses. Barbara was still around court, still had her titles and wealth, but she was no longer the power broker she'd been in the 1660s. Still, Charles's death marked a definite end to whatever influence she had left. Charles's brother, James II, didn't hate Barbara the way Catherine de' Medici hated Diane, but he didn't owe her anything either. She'd been Charles's stress, not his. And James was trying to navigate his own complicated reign as a Catholic king in a Protestant country. He didn't have time or inclination to maintain the support structure Charles had built around his former mistresses. Barbara lived another 24 years after Charles died, dying in 1709. But those years were marked by lawsuits, debts, scandals. She had been so wealthy during her peak years. How did she end up in financial trouble? Partly because she'd been extravagant, partly because she'd made bad investments, but partly because without Charles's ongoing support, without access to the flow of money and opportunities that came with being the king's favorite, her financial situation gradually deteriorated. She also burned through relationships. She'd been ruthless in accumulating power, and ruthless people don't always maintain friendships when they're no longer useful. The courtiers who'd fawned over her in 1665 had less time for her in 1705. She died at 68, comfortable but no longer important, a duchess by title but otherwise forgotten. Now here's the interesting case. Louise de Caraway, the Duchess of Portsmouth. Unlike Barbara, Louise managed her transition relatively well. When Charles died, she did face some difficulties. She was French and Catholic in an England that was suspicious of both, but she'd been more politically astute than Barbara. She'd maintained better relationships, she'd saved more money, and crucially, she still had the backing of Louis XIV of France. Louise returned to France after Charles's death and lived there comfortably for the rest of her life, dying in 1734 at age 85. She remained respected, received a pension from the French crown, and maintained her social position. She had successfully transitioned from English royal mistress to French noblewoman. She's one of the rare examples of a mistress who not only survived a royal lover's death, but thrived afterward. And then there's the most exceptional case, Madame de Pompadour, who is the only major mistress. We've discussed who died before her king. She died in 1764, and Louise de Vendée survived her by 10 years. This means she never experienced the vulnerability of losing her protector. She died at the peak of her influence, weakened by illness, yes, but still the king's confidant, still important, still powerful. When she died, Louis was devastated. He couldn't attend her funeral. Protocol forbade kings from attending funerals of anyone not family. But he stood at a balcony of Versailles in pouring rain, watching her funeral. Courtiers leave, and supposedly said, "This is the only tribute I can pay her." The King of France mourning his mistress publicly, acknowledging her importance even in death. That's a kind of victory. To die beloved rather than live to be discarded. But why was this transition from protected mistress to vulnerable widow so brutal for most of these women? Because everything about their position was unofficial. They had no legal claim to their apartments, their positions, their influence. Yes, many had been given estates and titles that were legally theirs, but access to the king, influence over policy, the respect of courtiers, all of that was based on personal relationship, not law. And personal relationships end with death. Think about it in modern terms. Imagine you work for a company, but you don't have an official position or contract. You're just there because the CEO likes you. You're influential, powerful even. Everyone knows you matter. But then the CEO dies or retires. What happens to you? Nothing legally protects your position. The new CEO has no obligation to you. Everything you built, it evaporates. That was the situation of royal mistresses, and the smart ones understood this and planned accordingly. Pomp. Adore made herself indispensable in multiple ways, culturally, politically, personally, so that even as their romantic relationship ended, Louise still needed her. Louise de Caraway maintained connections to France that gave her an exit strategy. But many others, Barbara Palmer, Diane Didier, assumed their power would last, or at least didn't adequately prepare for its end, and they paid the price. There's also the factor of age. Many of these women were older when the king died. Diane was 60 when Henry died. Barbara was in her 42nd when Charles died. Starting over becomes harder. The skills that made you a successful 25-year-old mistress beauty, charm, sexual appeal don't necessarily translate to being a 60-year-old widow. You can't just find another king and start again. And there's the social stigma. You've spent years as the king's critics called you. That doesn't just disappear when the king dies. Some people will always see you that way. Your reputation is permanently marked by your relationship. For the rest of your life, you're the former mistress of that's your identity, your label, your story. Everything you accomplished, everything you built, it gets reduced to that one relationship. But here's what strikes me as most poignant. Many of these women genuinely love the kings they were with. Yes, there was strategy. Yes, there was ambition. But Diane de Poitiers's 25-year devotion to Henry VII, that wasn't just calculated. Nell Gwyn's loyalty to Charles II until his death, that was real. Pompadour's 14 years as Louis XV's confidant after their romance ended. That was genuine friendship. And when these men died, these women didn't just lose power and position. They lost partners. They lost people they'd shared intimate parts of their lives with for decades. The grief was real, even as the political vulnerability was also real. Diane calling out for Henry during his final days wasn't about losing a protector. It was about losing the man she'd loved since he was a teenager. That's human tragedy, not just political calculation. So the fall from grace wasn't just about losing palaces and jewels and influence, though that was certainly part of it. It was about losing identity, purpose, security, and love all at once. It was about discovering that everything you'd built your life around was more fragile than you'd imagined. And it was about facing the question, what happens next? For most of these women, next was a retreat from public life, a comfortable but obscure retirement, and eventually death that history would barely notice. But what they left behind, the buildings, the art, the children, the stories that lived on. And that brings us to the real question. What does all of this mean? What can we learn from these stories of power and passion, strategy and suffering, triumph and tragedy? So, here we are after traveling through 2 centuries of hidden history, after meeting women who shaped nations from the shadows, after exploring the complex web of power, sex, politics, and human emotion that define the lives of royal mistresses. And the question we need to ask is, why does any of this matter? Why are we still telling these stories 300 and 400 years later? I think it's because these stories touch something fundamental about power and gender that hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. The specific circumstances are different. We don't have absolute monarchies in most of the Western world anymore, and women have legal rights and opportunities our historical subjects couldn't have dreamed of. But the underlying dynamics, those are still with us. Think about how we talk about powerful women today. How often do we see women's influence questioned or diminished by focusing on their relationships with powerful men? She only got that position because she's dating the CEO. She's just there because the boss likes her. We've created a society where women can theoretically have power in their own right. But we still often explain their power through their connections to men. That was the reality these royal mistresses lived with. But they turned it into strategy. They couldn't hold power directly, so they learned to wield influence indirectly. They couldn't command armies, so they influenced who commanded them. They couldn't write laws, so they shaped the thinking of the men who did. They operated in the gaps of the formal power structure, and they became extraordinarily good at it. Now, from a modern feminist perspective, is this empowering or oppressive? That's not a simple question. On one hand, these women were exercising agency within a system that denied them direct power. They were using every tool available to them to shape their world. Diane de Poitiers, Madame de Pompadour, even Nell Gwyn. They weren't passive victims. They were active participants in power, dynamics, making strategic choices, building influence, affecting history. On the other hand, the fact that they had to operate through men, that their power depended entirely on personal relationships, that they were always vulnerable to being discarded, that's deeply problematic. And the system that made this necessary was built on the subordination of women, on the idea that women couldn't hold power directly. So even as we admire their cleverness and strategy, we have to acknowledge the oppressive context that made such strategies necessary. But here's what I find most interesting. These women succeeded not by being what society wanted them to be, demure, passive, purely decorative, but by developing skills that would make anyone successful in any era. Reading people, building networks, strategic thinking, adaptability, politica, acumen, emotional intelligence, the ability to see opportunities and seize them. These aren't gendered skills, they're human skills, and the mistresses who succeeded had them in abundance. Think about Pompadour's transition from romantic mistress to platonic confidant. That required incredible emotional intelligence and strategic pivoting. She recognized that her value to Louis XV extended beyond physical attraction, and she successfully repositioned herself. How many people today, in business or politics or any field, successfully reinvent themselves when circumstances change? That's the same skill, just in a different context. Or think about Diane de Poyet's long game, her understanding that providing emotional support and practical advice to a traumatized young man would create a bond that lasted decades. That's relationship building at the highest level. Modern executives, diplomats, politicians, they do the same thing, just without the sexual dimension. Usually they identify key people early, invest in relationships, provide value, and build lasting connections. Diane just did it in the 16th century with fewer options available to her. Even Nell Gwynn's authenticity strategy, staying genuine, refusing to pretend to be something she wasn't, that's something we talk about in leadership circles today. Authentic leadership, bringing your whole self to work. The same principle that made Nell beloved in 1670 makes leaders effective in 2025. So yes, the context was oppressive. Yes, we should be glad we live in an era where women don't have to sleep with powerful men to exercise influence. But the skills these women developed, those are universal and timeless. And that's partly why their stories still resonate. Let's talk about modern parallels, because they exist even if we don't call them the same thing. We don't have royal mistresses anymore, but we have First Ladies who exercise enormous influence despite holding no elected position. Michelle Obama didn't run for office, but she shaped policy on childhood nutrition and education. Eleanor Roosevelt transformed the role of First Lady into a platform for social justice. These women wielded power without being elected through their relationships with powerful men. Sound familiar? Or think about corporate structures. The CEO's executive, assistant, or chief of staff. They often have more practical influence than people with more official titles. They control access. They shape the information the CEO sees. They're in the room where decisions are made. They're exercising informal power, power that exists because of their relationship to the person at the top. That's the same structural dynamic, just in a business context instead of a royal court. And in politics, how many times have we seen stories about the power behind the throne? The advisor, the spouse, the confidant who whispers in the ear of the president or prime minister. We're still fascinated by informal power, by influence that exists outside official channels, because we understand intuitively that the org chart doesn't always reflect where real power lives. But here's a key difference. In modern democracies, we're supposed to be suspicious of informal power. We have transparency requirements, conflict of interest rules, ethics laws, all designed to prevent exactly the kind of shadow influence that royal mistresses once wielded. We've decided that power should be formalized, accountable, subject to oversight, and that's probably good. But it also means that when informal influence does exist, and it always does, it's hidden more deeply, acknowledged less openly. At least in the 17th and 18th centuries, everyone knew Diane de Poyet had influence over Henri the Cent. It wasn't a secret conspiracy. It was just how things worked. Today, when a president's spouse or advisor exercises influence, there's often a question of whether they should be doing that, whether it's appropriate, whether it undermines democratic accountability. We're more uncomfortable with informal power precisely because we've built systems meant to formalize it. So what's the legacy of royal mistresses? On the most concrete level, it's the buildings and art and institutions they created. When you visit Versailles, when you see Sèvres porcelain in a museum, when you read Voltaire, you're experiencing their legacy. That's real, that's tangible, that lasts. On a genetic level, it's the descendants who carry their DNA forward through centuries. The current British aristocracy includes numerous people who descend from royal mistresses. Princess Diana was descended from Nell Gwyn. That legacy is literal and ongoing. On a cultural level, it's the stories themselves. These women became archetypes. The seductress, the political manipulator, the gold digger, the romantic heroine. Whether these archetypes are accurate or fair is debatable, but they've shaped how we think about women and power for centuries. When we call someone a pompadour, we're invoking a specific image of female influence. When we describe someone as living like Nell Gwyn, we mean something specific about authenticity and earthiness. These women became cultural touchstone, but on a deeper level, the legacy is about showing that power is more complex than we often acknowledge, that official titles don't always reflect real influence, that being excluded from formal power structures doesn't mean having no power, it just means exercising power differently. That marginalized people often develop sophisticated strategies for navigating systems designed to exclude them, and that these strategies, while born of oppression, demonstrate remarkable human ingenuity and resilience. These women lived in a time when they couldn't vote, couldn't own property independently, couldn't hold office, couldn't do most of the things we consider basic rights today, and yet some of them shaped history as much as the kings they slept with. They found ways to matter, to influence, to build, to create, working within and around the limitations placed on them. Is that a model for modern women? No, we shouldn't have to exercise power through relationships with men. We should and can hold power directly. But is it a reminder that people find ways to exercise agency even in oppressive systems? That restrictions don't always mean powerlessness? That influence can be cultivated even when authority is denied? Yes, absolutely. And here's perhaps the most important legacy. These women complicate easy narratives about history. They force us to acknowledge that the story of power isn't just about kings and battles and treaties. It's also about relationships, emotion, sexuality, and the private moments that shaped public decisions. It's about women who weren't supposed to matter but somehow did. It's about the gap between how power was supposed to work and how it actually worked. History tried to erase many of these women. When historians wrote about Henri II, they mentioned Dion Poitiers as a footnote if at all. When they wrote about Louis the Fini, they focused on his political failures, not Pompadour's cultural contributions. These women were deemed scandalous, unimportant distractions from the real history of kings and wars. But they weren't distractions, they were central. And the fact that we're still telling their stories, still fascinated by their lives, still trying to understand how they navigated their impossible situations, that suggests we recognize on some level that they matter, that their strategies and struggles and successes and failures have something to teach us about power, gender, and human nature. So, as we close this long journey through royal bedchambers and palace intrigues, as we step back from these stories of love and ambition and power and revenge, what do we take with us? Maybe it's an appreciation for complexity, that these women were neither pure victims nor pure villains, but humans navigating difficult circumstances with the tools available to them. Maybe it's an understanding that power has always been more fluid and informal than organizational charts suggest. Maybe it's a recognition that women have always found ways to influence their worlds even when officially powerless. Maybe it's just a good story welled about fascinating people living extraordinary lives. But I think the real takeaway is this. Behind every great king, there often was a woman, whispering in his ear. Sometimes she whispered wisdom. Sometimes she whispered self-interest. Usually she whispered both. And those whispers dismissed by contemporary historians as scandal, ignored by later historians as irrelevant. Those whispers shaped the course of nations. Those whispers echo through centuries. Those whispers remind us that history is made not just in throne rooms and battlefields, but in private chambers, where power and intimacy intertwine in ways that defy easy categorization. The kings are dead, the palaces remain, but as museums now. The system that made royal mistresses possible has crumbled, but the stories persist. And they persist because they're not really about kings and mistresses at all. They're about power and vulnerability, strategy and emotion, ambition and love. Themes that are as relevant now as they were 400 years ago. The setting changes. The fundamental human dynamics, those remain constant. And maybe that's the point. We tell these stories not because we want to return to that world. We don't. We tell them because they illuminate something true about the world we live in now. About how power really works. About how people navigate systems designed to exclude them. About how love and politics, intimacy and influence, private relationships and public consequences are always more entangled than we want to admit. So, sleep well tonight knowing that history is richer and stranger than textbooks suggest that the women who weren't supposed to matter sometimes mattered. Most. And that 4 centuries later we're still learning from their triumphs and their tragedies, their brilliance and their flaws, their impossible positions and their remarkable strategies for navigating them. The kings are remembered in history books, but the mistresses, they're remembered in stories.